Hi, good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait maybe 30 more seconds just for some more people to log in. And Ashley, I'm going to ask you to go on mute because I heard reverb from my voice into your computer. So once again, we're just waiting for a few more people to log in and we will get started shortly. I see a few more people trickling in, so hello and welcome. I'm just going to wait maybe a couple more seconds, and then we'll get started. Couple more people coming in, I can see them. Okay, so it's 9:02. We will get started just out of respect for everyone's time. So good morning and welcome everyone to the Ontario Biodiversity Council Summit. We're so glad you're here and that you could join us. And thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be a champion for biodiversity. So a couple housekeeping items. Our presenters will be on webcam. However, if you're not speaking, we'll just ask that you turn your camera off and remain on mute. For all of our listeners, we're hoping for some participation from you this morning. And you're welcome to ask questions to our team. So we're going to be using the question function on GoToWebinar, which is different from the chat. So please just be mindful that if you're putting something in the chat, I don't think you're going to have that option that we'll be able to see it. So please use the question function, and that function will be monitored by our team, and then we can ask those questions to whoever it's directed to or the panelists at the end of our morning. So see a couple more people coming in. Welcome. All right, so this session is called Mainstreaming Biodiversity Within Business, and my name is Ashley Fox, and I'll be your co-chair this morning. And I'm currently an environmental advisor at Ontario Power Generation, also known as OPG. And I oversee the biodiversity conservation program across our Ontario fleet. And my co-chair is Ashley Zellick, and I enthusiastically call us the A-team. So Ashley, the floor is yours to introduce yourself.
Great, thanks Ashley. So I am the Director of Environment and Education with the Ontario Stone, Sand and Gravel Association. In my role, I manage and promote the environmental and educational initiatives for the industry, and I monitor and report on environmental progress within the industry. And I also represent OSBA on Ontario's Biodiversity Council. Back to you, Ashley.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so for those who may not be super familiar with the Ontario Biodiversity Council, and what our session is really about today, of course, I'm going to be explaining that, and I'll have a land acknowledgement before we get into the meat and potatoes of our webinar. So the Ontario Biodiversity Council is composed of members from environmental and conservation groups, industry associations, Indigenous organizations, academia, and government. and we have created Ontario's first biodiversity strategy. So the council promotes the view that our wealth and prosperity, our quality of life, and our well-being are directly tied to the province's biological diversity. So on that note, today's session will speak to the need to change business from being a driver of biodiversity loss to a driver of protection and restorative action for biodiversity. So we'll be highlighting conservation guidance and certification programs, as well as case studies. And it'll be followed up by discussing why businesses should invest in conservation activities and what positive outcomes you can expect from doing that. All right, so before we get started, it's important that we take the time to acknowledge the treaties and territories of Indigenous peoples because it's a reminder that the privileges and benefits we enjoy as citizens of Ontario are rooted in the long-standing treaties and historical relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I currently live in Whitby, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe and acknowledge their commitment to the stewardship of this area and their teachings about the land. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Ashley to discuss the agenda.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. So we are really excited to bring you a great lineup of presenters for today's session. You can see the agenda there on the screen in front of you. We will have 2 breaks, so opportunities for you to stretch your legs and refill your coffee. And the end of the day, we'll wrap up with a moderated Q&A. So we will be monitoring the question box, as Ashley had mentioned, for any questions that you have throughout the presentations, and we will have time for that as permits. But if we didn't get a chance to get to your question, we do have that moderated Q&A at the end of the day or at the end of the session, and we hope to answer your questions then. So I'll just jump to the next slide. Great. So before we jump into our keynote speaker, we wanted to take just a minute or two to discuss one of the indicators from the 2015 State of Ontario's Biodiversity Report. So in recent years, a critical link has been identified between society and the economy and the natural environment. And many business leaders, of course, are recognizing that, especially to remain competitive, that biodiversity issues must be factored into their plan. And even the public is being more aware of their impact on the natural environment and asking for that of the companies in which they interact with. So this 2015 index surveys integration of biodiversity within business operations of 70 companies within Ontario. They were categorized within 4 main sectors: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Within each industry, what they did was look at 5 of the most profitable publicly traded companies within Canada, and it included companies that had either headquarters or operated in Ontario or sold products in Ontario. And what the index did was look at annual corporate reports and information via company websites. And just really high level, the results showed that only 4% of companies in the study did not consider biodiversity or environmental issues in their corporate programs or policies. 16% reported on biodiversity, 24% of companies considered biodiversity a key strategic issue and actually developed plans and policy to address these issues. And interestingly enough, the primary sector had the greatest level of biodiversity integration, with the tertiary sector having only 4%. So it's important to note that this was a first-time indicator in 2015, and we're hopeful that updated data will continue to show the extent in which Ontario companies have integrated biodiversity into their corporate planning and reporting. And I also want to know that ISO has recently recognized that strengthening biodiversity is fundamental to sustainable development, and as a result, in 2020, they formed a committee developed at looking at biodiversity standards. And the goal, of course, is that the use of the future standards will enable organizations to directly contribute to United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So, of course, the development of this standard will be closely monitored with anticipation for the impact that it could have with respect to strengthening businesses' approach to biodiversity. I'll turn it back over to you now, Ashley.
Perfect. Thank you. That was informative. Okay, so now I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker for this morning. Her name is Margaret O'Gorman, and Margaret operates at the intersection of business and nature. As the president of the Wildlife Habitat Council, also known as WHC, she helps companies find value in natural resources conservation and mainstream biodiversity across operations. She works with multinational corporations to develop integrated strategies to implement conservation projects to meet business needs, and in doing so, enhance ecosystems, connect communities, and engage employees. Margaret also helps WHC members build conservation into their sustainability efforts and helps sustain conservation efforts through WHC's signature conservation certification recognition, which serves to define the standard for corporate conservation worldwide. So Margaret, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Ashley and Ashley, and thanks for mentioning our standards. So we hope that whatever ISO is developing will certainly learn from us a little bit, as we have a lot of experience in that arena. The last time I spoke at the Ontario Biodiversity Summit, Business and Biodiversity was a panel. An hour long was spent discussing business and biodiversity. And I think the fact that a big session has been dedicated to business and biodiversity really shows how far we have come. And I'd like to thank especially Steve Hounsell, who has been a champion for business and biodiversity throughout his career, and for thanking him for inviting us to participate. And also thank you to Ashley Fox and OPG, who we work with a lot. So what I'm going to do today is try to set the scene of where we are from the last business and biodiversity discussion at the Ontario Biodiversity Summit to today. And I think we've come a long way, and we've come a long way for a variety of reasons. But I want to start with a story about a piping plover and a steel mill. The piping plover, as many of you know, is a small shorebird that has migratory paths from South and Central America up through Central North America and, of course, the Atlantic coast. It's a species at risk in Ontario, and it's a federally endangered species in the US. It's also pretty cute. This is a piping plover chick. And we've worked with a steel company, Cleveland Cliffs, for many, many years on the southern shores of Lake Michigan. And we've worked with them at a steel mill that is like what anybody would imagine a steel mill to be. This is a steel mill that was built in the 1960s. It's loud, it's hot, it's got molten materials and big trucks. And it's also on the shores of Lake Michigan, as I said. And a few years ago, one of the environmental managers at that steel mill, a guy called Rob Maciel, decided he was going to reclaim 40 acres of lakeshore property for nature. That property it had on it 40-foot high slag heaps, which is a byproduct from the steel mill. It also had contractors' huts, and it just had general rubbish that collects on an industrial site over time. And Rob was able to clear that site, and he was able to work with Wildlife Habitat Council and others to regrade, to replant, and to reconfigure the site so that it would become good habitat for biodiversity. And when you go there today, it is a really interesting place to be, because when you look out over Lake Michigan, behind you, you have a belching, smelting steel mill. In front of you, you have Lake Michigan. And right beside you, you have one of the newest national parks in the US, which is the Indiana Dunes National Park. And across the fence line is this property on the steel mill. And what's really interesting is that the property on the steel mill now is better piping plover habitat than the property on the federally protected land across the fences. And that's purely because it is private land and it's business land. It's land that does not have easy access. So the park across the fence line sees thousands of Chicago residents and Northwest Indiana residents coming to recreate in the dunes every spring. And every spring is when the piping plover are laying well camouflaged eggs in the sand, and they're at high risk from people, from pets, and from general disturbance. So by providing 40 acres on an active steel mill in prime piping plover habitat, Cleveland Cliffs and the facility at Burns Harbor is actually contributing to the recovery of a species at risk, an endangered species, in a way that the protected land across the fence cannot do. And that's just an example of how to reframe and rethink about corporate lands for conservation, how to think about that a company can continue an operation, can continue to be in business, but also can continue to contribute to biodiversity outcomes, and in this case, to the federal recovery program for the piping plover. So the last time I was there, the place was humming with pollinators. There was an American kestrel hovering. I think they've had killdeer certainly nesting there. I'm not sure they've had the piping plovers yet, but it's been a while, so we need to check in with them. But I think it's a really good way to rethink about how business interacts with biodiversity. And the main way that business interacts with biodiversity that we have found, Wildlife Habitat Council, we've been working at that intersection of business and biodiversity for 30 years. And what we found is the best way to connect business to biodiversity is by presenting the business case. And this is not a business case about dollars and cents. This is a business case about understanding how nature-based action can solve problems, can create opportunities, and can actually contribute to strategic management and operational goals of a company. So we've identified over our 30 years 16 common reasons for businesses to participate in, to use biodiversity, to leverage biodiversity. So of course the top one is the biodiversity impacts. Companies like in OSSGA that are mining companies and quarrying companies that have a direct impact, of course they need to attend to that impact and mitigate that impact. But all of the other areas are not due to traditional impacts, but instead really think about how to integrate or how to mainstream biodiversity into thinking about your operations. So when we think about companies that may have remediation liabilities, the ways to remediate in effect and to repair those lands, nature can play a great role in the active chemistry and biology of repairing those lands, but can also play a significant role in helping the community impacted by the pollution, by the damage done to the lands, to see those lands in a greater way and in a more valuable way, and also to return those lands to community in a way that they can use them and can seek value for them. We're increasingly seeing the importance of social license to operate and how companies need to invest in the communities in which they have impact to secure their social license to operate, to allow them to continue doing what they're doing, but to ensure that the community is at peace with that operation being there. And we have seen again and again where companies can use nature as a way to secure their social license to operate. Now, of course, it's not the only thing that they can do. I mean, companies need to be good neighbors and good community members. But we have seen, for example, Waste Management, which is the large waste hauling company, where they've been investing in nature-based activities to secure their social license to operate for 30 years now. They have a site in Pennsylvania where there's a 3-generation pollinator project throughout the community. It's in the elementary school, it's at a retirement community, and it's at their very large landfill. And by connecting these 3 efforts together, they're able to really engage all levels of the community into their projects. And they've been very successful at securing that social license to operate in such a way that when they sought permission to open a new cell on a landfill, they received 0 negative comments from a community that is pretty plugged into what they're doing there, a community that's pretty engaged and pretty sophisticated. So part of that investment in nature is something that helped them secure that ability to operate their landfill in that community. And as we go through, corporate thinking, we see more and more corporate citizenship, corporate social responsibility, engaging with nature as a way to make investments in education, where companies who have lands in communities that may not have access to traditional nature centres or to provincial parks can make those investments in education. For example, in the town of Windsor, Ontario, BASF is using a site that they have in the Detroit River, Fighting Island, as an education facility where the children come across by boat and learn at the site about environmental topics and get to go and do water sampling and build bug houses and things like that. But basically BASF is using that land as an accessible nature centre for the children in that school district. And as we move through, Ashley mentions the sustainability goals and the SDGs. We're increasingly seeing how biodiversity connects into the SDGs, and companies see biodiversity and nature-based work as a positive sustainability KPI. So it's a key performance indicator that is showing growth. Most key performance indicators for sustainability are about a race to zero, reduction in water, reduction in greenhouse gases, reduction in waste to landfill. But when we look at biodiversity in nature as a key performance indicator, we're seeing an increase in biodiversity, an increase in habitat, an increase in the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. So it really serves to have a nice positive key performance indicator for sustainability. And then just in general business management, where we're seeing employee engagement becoming so important, especially as we return to the workplace right now. And one of the cool things about nature-based activities is that is a safe way to gather as we bring employees back. There's nothing safer than being outside and engaging with the nature programs that are being implemented at site. We're also seeing climate change come in a big way into the conversation, whether it be in a company's climate mitigation strategy, but also very much in a company's climate adaptation and resilience strategy. And we'll get to that later on. And nature-based solutions all fits in with that. So we found that when companies can see business value for nature-based action, that they're more likely to invest and more likely to maintain that investment over the long term and through disruptions, whether it's a corporate disruption like a merger or acquisition, or a global disruption like a pandemic. We saw through the pandemic that the majority of the programs that we worked with continued doing what they were doing. They had to, of course, pivot to different ways of doing it. But those investments, because they were not philanthropic in nature, but they're actually linked to business value, were deemed valuable enough for them to continue through the pandemic and the shift that we all had to do during that time. So I think that's really interesting when we think and frame business and nature in that business value way. So we've been doing that for 30 years. And what we've seen then recently is these global trends in helping businesses understand a bit more about the value of nature. So over the last few years, 2 years really, we've been seeing significant movement on the global stage where multinational companies are making, biodiversity strategies like BP that publish their biodiversity strategy, and that made a lot of companies pay attention. Last year, we saw the Leaders Pledge for Nature, which was government leaders all over the world, including the Prime Minister in Canada, the President of France, the Prime Minister in the UK, and of course the President in the US. Actually, it was this year, I'm sorry, I'm confusing my years, pledged to take a significant amount of the investments for climate and shift them to nature and shift them to looking at 30 by 30, which is the 30% protected by 2030. We're seeing the financial community take notice, where the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures has been stood up to create mechanisms for companies to really understand what their nature-related risk is. We have the big COP15, everybody's talking about COP26 at the moment, which is the climate COP, but we also have the biodiversity COP. Biodiversity COP is COP15, and it's going to be looking this year at its post-2020 agenda. So the Aichi targets for the original agenda, none of those targets were met. And the COP needs to pivot. The Convention on Biological Diversity really needs to get more aggressive in their goals and in how they can push those goals out to society as a whole. So that post-2020 agenda is going to be very important for business. And it's going to be very important for business because the CBD has recognized that business has to play a role in the development of the agenda. Part of the reason the SDGs are successful is that business was allowed to play a role in the development of the SDGs. So the WBCSD, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, has made a policy recommendation for the post-2020 agenda and is asking that there be implementable goals for business. It's asking that business be involved, and there's many initiatives and frameworks driving that. So when we see the post-2020 agenda, we should see a role for business, which is new. And then as we look from the global to the regional government, we're seeing in, for example, the EU and in Europe, that there is they've got the Green New Deal, which is their Green Deal, which is moving ahead, but they've also got pending a piece of legislation that is going to impact companies, whether they're in Europe or not. Their due diligence legislation is going to ask companies to look at their supply chain and examine both human rights and biodiversity impacts on that supply chain. So whether the company is actually located in Germany or whether it's located in Ontario, it's not going to matter. They're going to have to feed in to the EU due diligence legislation. And in some cases, some countries like Germany and the Netherlands are adopting even stronger regulations that are being built on that due diligence legislation. So these are all global signifiers that are happening with the companies across the world that is pushing more businesses to be involved with biodiversity, more businesses to understand that they have a biodiversity risk, and more businesses to actually say that biodiversity is a materiality for them. So in addition to that, WHC internally, we're seeing a lot of interest from companies seeking to do biodiversity profiles, seeking to do biodiversity assessments, whether it be on their supply chain, on their own lands, or across the entire company. And these are not companies that have traditionally worked with us, where we've worked very solidly in many industry sectors. These are new industry sectors to us. So we're certainly seeing those winds of change moving towards supporting business and biodiversity. So then the other thing that we're seeing is this supply chain. So this is the membership of WHC, all little tiny logos if you're on a screen, but it shows how everything is connected. And when we think about supply chains, we normally think about the extraction, where it comes from the very beginning, and we kind of think about the retail end, how people are buying it and using it. But there's a whole section in the middle that needs to connect their land use across for biodiversity across their supply chains. So what's happening today is we're seeing industries at either end of the supply chains pushing the industries in the middle to make statements, to assess their biodiversity. And for example, chemical companies that have not normally addressed biodiversity impacts from their operations, or biodiversity uplifts from their operations that they could be doing, are now getting engaged there. So we're seeing industries that have not been traditionally engaged with biodiversity becoming engaged with biodiversity because of that pressure. And it could be because of the EU due diligence legislation, but it just could be that many companies are trying to adopt whether it's because of circular economy, cradle to cradle, or just in general supply chain greening, that we're seeing that because every company is connected to another company, that there's a great possibility to do some joined up thinking along the supply chain and see what we can do. So that's been an interesting trend for us. And we've seen that really come home in the auto industry. So in Ontario, I know you've got General Motors and Toyota. And what we have done is worked with a supply chain initiative that's called the Suppliers Partnership for the Environment. And the Suppliers Partnership for the Environment is driven by the OEMs, Toyota, Fiat Chrysler, now Stellantis, General Motors, Ford, and others. And what they are doing is gathering their suppliers around certain areas of interest And some of those areas of interest are those that you would think about: how to do battery recycling, how to divert waste from landfills, etc. But what they did at the beginning, and it was very smart, is they integrated biodiversity from the very beginning. So companies that don't traditionally think about how they could integrate biodiversity into their operations were being asked as part of this initiative to do so. So that led to some very interesting conversations, but it also led to a lot of excitement, and positive excitement, from the point of view of the suppliers. And we worked with the suppliers partnership to develop a toolkit for these companies. So these companies who haven't thought about biodiversity before, who are probably not reporting on biodiversity, but because of the pressure from the OEMs, they now have to think about how could they implement biodiversity programs on their lands. And some of their lands may be very constrained. Some of them may be in industrial parks that they don't have a lot to do. So that's why we focused on pollinators, because it was a lot easier than, say, focusing on forestry. So we developed this practical guide for these companies to think about how to get started, what to do, how to manage it, how to engage the stakeholders, and then how to tell your story and recognize it. So by providing this toolkit that really understood the context of these companies, that they were not large landholding companies, that they were doing this because they're part of this initiative, but really framing the biodiversity possibility within their reality, was a great way to build up their confidence and also engage them. So right now, the biodiversity work group at the Suppliers Partnership for the Initiative is one of the most popular ones, because again, it's all about uplift, it's all about positivity, and the number of co-benefits associated with it are really infinite, because you can connect everything to your biodiversity program: employees, education, health, reporting into the SDGs. There's so many things that you can do with that. So it's a really successful approach. And that approach also is just one entry point. So what we've seen with our companies is that there are so many entry points, there's so many places to start. So when we work with General Motors, that was a top-down engagement from leadership to the sites. But when we work with somebody like, say, CRH, it could be a middle company, the middle management getting involved to support the leadership, but also support the sites. We see companies moving up and down their streams, whether it be internally or externally. And we're seeing companies engage as CSR initiatives. So Johnson & Johnson, the big pharmaceutical company, has biodiversity as one of their CSR initiatives, engaging their CSR teams at every site to get involved in biodiversity. And we're definitely seeing an increase in stakeholders encouraging companies to do this. So there are so many entry points, and we tried to map them recently with thinking about the companies that we work with and where they sit in terms of how they approach biodiversity and how they deploy their biodiversity projects. So, for example, General Motors was very strategic when they worked with us. They set a global sustainability goal for biodiversity. It was part of their sustainability strategy, and then they really took a strategic approach to rolling it out across all of their facilities and all of their industries. And it was also very prescriptive. You need to do this, you need to achieve this, and you need to report into us around that. But then a company like Shell is opportunistic. What can we do? What are we looking at? We're looking at nature-based solutions. How can we do that? How can we get it recognized? So there are different ways in which to do it. And of course, it's decentralized out into the facilities, or is it also part of a central message from leadership? So there's no single way and no correct way to engage business in biodiversity. That is a key message. And I think you'll see when you hear from my colleagues, Josiane and Rob, that there are so many different ways to do it. And I think that's very important to note, that there is no single correct way. And there's no correct way either, because we've got this plethora of corporate frameworks that companies are expected to adhere to. Each one of these treats biodiversity in a different way. So again, we have to be flexible when we work with companies. There's no single way, there's no single framework, there's no single metric. And in many ways, there's no single definition of biodiversity. So flexibility is an entirely important approach when we engage companies with biodiversity. And that allows flexibility, that allows us to be to use that flexibility in a way that can show how biodiversity has so many co-benefits. So we wrote a white paper recently about the SDGs and the conservation connection, and how much biodiversity action can feed into the individual SDGs. This is just a little infographic from that white paper that shows that, for example, in urban areas, conservation action can contribute to sustainable cities and communities. Looking at nature-based solutions, looking at green infrastructure, just looking at having nature in cities can contribute to SDG 11. It can contribute to responsible consumption and production in so many ways when we think about ways to use waste for conservation activities, and also to think about how lands are used for conservation activities. But I won't go into too much detail in that. We can maybe put the link to that white paper in the chat so that you can access it. But it just shows that if you're flexible in your approach, you can also be flexible in how you leverage what you're doing, and how then the company can actually report out on it. So I think that is, that's one of the sweet spots. And the other sweet spot that we're seeing, I said we'd come back to climate, and we're going to end on climate, is that, we know that we all, industry and everybody, are having an impact on climate. We know that climate then is having an impact on people and where they live. And we know that we all have an impact on nature. But when you flip that on the head and you think about nature, and you think about nature-based solutions can have a positive impact on people and the communities and where they live. An impact on the quality of life, on the cleanliness of the air, on a resilience to storms. It can have an impact on climate change for the same reason, by providing resilience and adaptation, but also by being that big carbon sink. And then it can then have that same impact on business as an overall corporate entity, but more so as a local entity. Every company is made up of locations. Every location has an impact one way or the other. And nature can provide a solution for all of these impacts. And that's really how we need to think about it going forward. It's not climate or nature, it's nature helping everything else. And that would be my pitch for businesses to really think about this, and to move beyond just nature as an opportunistic, and move beyond nature as an opportunistic way of thinking about things, and really think about it as that sweet spot to help to solve many of the world's problems. So with that, I'll stop, and I'll thank you for your attendance today and for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Margaret. That was fantastic. So I'm just looking to see if we have any questions in the question box. And to our attendees, if you do have a question for Margaret, we do have a couple minutes. Please put your question in the question box, not the chat box, and we're happy to read those aloud for you. In the meantime, Margaret, I do have a question just to, get us started. I was wondering, what are the common misconceptions people have about biodiversity conservation and like making a difference, and how can we combat these misconceptions?
That is a great question, Ashley. And I think there's two, I think, that we come across. One is that you need a lot of land. And you don't. You need a lot of land for certain biodiversity outcomes. But when you think about the fact that our insect populations are basically collapsing at the moment, and that our pollinator populations are at great risk, and you think about the fact that pollinators don't need a lot of land. What they need is a lot of plots of land, and those plots of land can be small or they can be big. So we really try to get companies to think about what land they have and what is possible on that land. Of course, you need large acres and hectares of land to do reforestry programs and things like that. But I think that's one of the misconceptions is I have no land. We have been able to help companies that say they have no land to really see and think about how they can use that lack of land to benefit our pollinators. And I just want to say, like, for pollinators, we all know like 1 in every 3 bites of food we eat is from pollinators. But from a business point of view, if the pollinator population collapsed and disappeared tomorrow, that would be the equivalent of General Motors, Ford, and Toyota going out of business today. That would be the economic equivalent of that and the impact on the global economy. So it's not just about monarch butterflies, you know, and those iconic species. It's also about economic resilience. So that's the first one. And the second one is that it costs a lot. It doesn't have to cost a lot. It can cost a lot if you're moving earth and, you know, changing your hydrologies and things like that. But there are activities that you can do that can have significant uplift for biodiversity that are not expensive and that may actually save you money. One of my bugbears is these massive mowed lawns all over corporate campuses in North America, and the missed opportunity of saving a ton of money if they could only be put into meadows. We'd save money and we would help rescue the pollinator populations at the same time.
Love it. Thank you very much. So Ashley, do we have any questions in the question box?
We don't, Ashley.
Okay, so let's keep going. So I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. So
Thank you, Margaret.
Thanks, Margaret. Our next speaker today is Natasha Dabrowski, and Natasha is a recognized environmental professional with 10 years of progressive experience in the mining industry. And in 2020, she was nominated for a Canadian Institute of Mining National Award by her peers and was selected as one of the finalists among mining environmental professionals Canada-wide. As the Director of Environment and Sustainability for Kirkland Lake Gold Canadian Operations, she specializes in complex environmental permitting, environmental project management, and regular and Indigenous and community engagement and consultation. Welcome, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And thank you everybody for having me today and providing me the opportunity to introduce you to our company in the context of biodiversity, and maybe give folks a bit of an insider tour about some of the initiatives that we're undertaking here, as well as in the mining industry as a whole. So I'm just getting the mouse situated. So a quick overview of the agenda today. We will talk about what biodiversity means to us here at Kirkland Lake Gold. We'll talk about our approach and how we measure performance. And then we're going to get into the fun stuff. So we're going to get into some case studies. We're going to talk about woodland caribou in the context of our Detour Lake mine, which is where I'm reporting to you from today. We're going to talk about some of our closure objectives, also at DLM. And then we'll get into progressive reclamation. And then we'll talk about some of the ongoing biodiversity case studies that we have at our other operations. So as some of you may or may not know, Kirkland Lake Gold is a mid-tier gold producer, and we have operations both here in Canada as well as Australia. And as Margaret so eloquently touched on, you know, biodiversity means different things to different people, and nobody's wrong. But for us here at Kirkland Lake Gold, our definition that we've trickled through the company and our operations is what you see on the screen there. So biodiversity is the variety and variability present in our ecosystems, and also their interactions with each other. As we know, biodiversity is essential for the function and survival of the ecosystems that society and also economic activities depend on. So we've adapted this particular definition based on the ICMM guidance, and it really is the foundation of our biodiversity management system here at the company. So as I mentioned, we're very fortunate to have operations that are located within different regions that have very diverse ecosystems and habitats, all of which are very unique and important biologically, ecologically, in terms of values, which means that our biodiversity management plans are customized and very unique to each area or each operation that we're working in. So as such, we are committed to protecting biodiversity, including critical habitats and species at risk, And also we integrate biodiversity conservation throughout our activities and operations. And so how do we do that? So our approach to biodiversity management is really focused on 3 key pillars that aims to protect and preserve. So the first is to identify and categorize, monitoring and reporting, and then research and development. And we'll jump into these in a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides. And you'll see these emblems or these symbols carried throughout the presentation. And that's going to help identify which activities fit into which areas of focus. So sort of a nice infographic as we go through. So identify and categorize, this is really the first initiative. This is the boots on the ground effort. So obviously a very important part of protecting and preserving biodiversity is building the knowledge base of species. So it's important to know what we're hoping to protect and what we're hoping to preserve. So here at Kirkland Lake Gold, we are continuously working to gather that baseline information and valuable information on the ecosystems in which we operate, and also get further information on the species that utilize these habitats and call them home. Monitoring and reporting, pretty self-explanatory, but all of our sites have been assessed for biodiversity, and we've gone through this through several different media and sort of frameworks, but the one that we touched on here is the International Union for Conservation and Nature's Red List of threatened species, and it is the world's largest, most comprehensive information source for the potential extinction risk on animals, fungi, and plants. So as it stands right now, globally, only 2 species near our properties have been identified in the critically endangered category within the IUCN. So that's the swift parrot and the Regent honey badger. And so both of these species do have regional importance, and they are part of routine biodiversity assessment. So utilizing some of these frameworks really allows us to focus areas of monitoring research and where they are needed most. And we're going to see that as we move into some of our discussions on woodland caribou in the upcoming slides. And so research and development, I'm sure that we all know what this is, but of course provides significant opportunities and allows information to be reviewed in a more technical manner, and also allows data to be considered in a broader scale while being exposed to sort of new areas of research and focus. So we are involved in various research and development projects. 2 notable ones, we're working with the University of Guelph for our native seed and revegetation programs, and also with Waterloo for some of our MLARD work. So it does allow us to help further the science in these areas of focus, and it's also helping to bolster both provincial and national academic research programs. Okay, so the first case study and the first area of focus that I'd like to talk about is our woodland caribou monitoring program. So as some of you may or may not know, Detour Lake Mine is located well, we're in Northern Ontario, of course, and we are located within the Kasagami Woodland Caribou Range. Now, woodland caribou are considered threatened both provincially and federally, so this species is of utmost importance to us. So the population does, it is sensitive and it does require a little bit more extra care. So because of this, and because we do operate in woodland caribou territory here at DLM, we have committed to ensuring that we provide and create double the amount of woodland caribou habitat sort of throughout operations than is currently what is here right now. So the goal specifically that we've outlined, we do want to create 50 square kilometers of area for woodland habitat. And this is going to start during operations, but also it's going to be carrying through post-closure programs as well. And we have started to tailor some of our post-closure programs, and they're starting to target things like lichen, landscape restoration in ways that are going to be favorable to woodland caribou. So, and I'm going to talk about some of the closure and reclamation specifics as we go through. So separate yet very much parallel and very much intertwined. So in terms of our population monitoring program, so DLM has been monitoring woodland caribou since 2008, and this started off with our aerial survey program. So the monitoring consists of that aerial surveys, and then in 2016, we expanded the program to include a satellite telemetry collaring tracking program, and we'll talk about the nuances of that in the upcoming slides. But really the monitoring program helps us to identify some of the important habitat areas that woodland caribou are utilizing around the mine to help inform mitigation and also reclamation strategies. So when we're talking about woodland caribou habitat, so it's certainly not enough just to say that woodland caribou are in a certain location. There are 3 distinct types of habitat that caribou utilize. So category 1 habitat is really of utmost importance to us. So this is some of the high use areas that exhibit repeated intensive use by individual caribou or individual groups. So they are favoring these habitats specifically for uses such as nursery areas, winter use areas, and also travel corridors. These areas do have lower tolerance to alteration before we start to see the function of caribou compromise. So category 1 habitat is really the most sensitive and really the one that we are the most interested in preserving and protecting. Then we move down the list to category 2. So this is some of the seasonal ranges. So caribou do not typically distribute evenly within seasonal ranges across the years. And again, this particular type of habitat is more moderate in terms of sensitivity to disturbance. So it's really that sort of in between. And then category 3 is the most robust. So this is all the remaining other habitat that caribou will utilize. And it does tend to have higher tolerance to alteration before we see any sort of impairment to function of the herd. So knowing the different types of habitat, it helps us inform that reclamation and closure considerations. So here's a quick snapshot from the aerial survey program. So again, this is something that we've been doing since 2018. And the aerial survey program is a really great way to develop snapshots in time. So some of these sort of heat maps that you see about where the population is and also the general size of the population. So because the population is threatened, of course, we want to know how they're utilizing the land, but also the number. So if we're seeing any sort of changes in that sort of number. Over time with the aerial survey program, we are seeing, at least the data is suggesting, that there is a trend of increasing mean relative density of the woodland caribou herd within the study area. So this is very great news. And something else to consider, and something that's important for us to consider, is that the monitoring results are showing that woodland caribou are largely avoiding areas within 10 kilometers of the mine site. So on this map here, I appreciate that it's zoomed out, but this sort of black blob, this is all of our DLM site. So, and you can see the heat maps are showing sort of the rough areas where we tend to see woodland caribou with the aerial survey program. Now, in 2016, we added an additional layer of sort of technology and comprehensive monitoring to our program. So this is when we deployed our first satellite telemetry GPS collaring program. So we deployed 20 collars on 20 female caribou, and we wanted to track specific caribou and get a better understanding explicitly of how they're using the land over the course of the year. And we did want to get a better understanding of how they're utilizing, or at least how we can define those 3 types of categories of habitat. Obviously, the female caribou were preferred, and they were important in this study because we want to get a sense of specifically where some of those nursery areas may be, because they are the most sensitive. So this particular area, when you're looking at this map, this orange sort of quad shape that you're seeing, this is the study area. It was around 2,600 square kilometers. You can see the Detour Lake Mine, again, is this symbolic black blob that you can see. And there's a couple of these yellow X's. So in 2016, these were the locations of the initial collaring program. So this is the information that we got from the first year of the program. Now we fast forward to 2020, and this is the information that we've gathered thus far. So we'll walk through some of the trends or some of the information that we can see here. So the individual dots, or any of the colors that you see here, indicate that a GPS location ping was sent to a satellite anywhere between 2016 and 2020. So again, this is the 4 years worth of cumulative data. The X's, so these are some of these orange sort of darker colors, and I appreciate it may not be too easy to see. But those X's are important because they indicate a probable parturition location, or specifically where calving may be occurring. Some of these yellow blobs, for lack of a better term, they're showing a probable nursery overlap area between female caribou. So some of these areas are favored by some of the females over year after year. So we're getting a sense of where they're returning to have that nursery. And then some of these turquoise areas here, some of the blobs, these are showing, or we're thinking that these are more overwintering habitats. And again, they're overlapping as well. So we are seeing some trends within the herd that females do favor certain areas over time. So when we look at this map, a couple key takeaways. So we are seeing a very high density here of favoritism, or at least of land use around the Kisagami Provincial Park, which is to be expected. But we can also see some of these other smaller areas where caribou are favoring utilizing the land over the seasons. So, and important to note that we do see a little bit, we do see that avoidance of in and around 10 kilometers of around the mine site. And I'll zoom us into the next slide here. So again, we can see that we have this yellow blob, which is again some of that the overlap of the nursery areas. And we do see this confirmed area here, which we do believe is a parturition location. So the takeaway here is that caribou are generally avoiding the mine site, which is good. Also, we're confident that we do have a good understanding here that this is a nursery area, so that it would be considered category 1 and therefore the most sensitive and the least tolerant to any kind of disturbance. So this is really important because we can now aim to avoid these areas with some of our long-term planning and life of mine. And also, you know, when we come to planning, we could be mindful and sensitive of some of the other areas in and around the site. So it really is important to have this information up front and have it communicated throughout all aspects of our operation and our business. Now, in terms of the movement of the herd itself, this slide is showing a bit more of a detailed location data from the telemetry program that we collected. And this is showing movement across all seasons. So again, woodland caribou generally don't spend significant amount of time in the Detour Lake mine specifically. However, they do tend to move through it to access some of those seasonal ranges to the northeast and south of the mine. So again, gives us a better understanding of how woodland caribou are utilizing the land. So of course, avoidance is certainly one aspect of maintaining and preserving biodiversity, but restoration is another. And this is another area of focus for the mine site. So road networks, so as you can see on the map here, are really important restoration projects for us because they provide easy opportunities for predation and hunting because they do have those clear lines of sight. So in terms of restoration or reclamation, they're great candidate areas for us because we can do work to improve those corridors to maintain access for all animals and species within, but also maybe to remove some of those lines of sight and remove some of those areas that make the species a little bit more vulnerable. So a couple of good things that we like to consider when we're looking at potential roads: they are near the mine and they are sufficient size to offset potential impacts. So they are a great candidate once again. They do, in this particular area here, they are subject to different forestry harvesting schedules. So this is ideal because it means that the habitat suitability will be different and will improve over time, depending on which row we choose to rehabilitate. So if they're all on the same harvesting schedule, they may pose a little bit of a problem for us long term. And again, when we look at road habitats, it does make it a little bit more concrete to aim for that really specific rehabilitation number. So that 50 kilometers squared, now we know how to measure and monitor that moving forward. So this is a great opportunity for us. And don't worry, we won't be reading this table in detail, but I wanted to throw it up there just to give a sense that you know, there are specific restoration activity options. And it also shows some of the benefits that they could bring over time. So some of them provide benefit in the short term, some of them will provide benefit more in the long term. And it also helps us focus where the conservation activity can take place specifically to yield the highest payoff or the benefit. So again, it's sort of a nice opportunity depending on what our options are at that time. If we're looking to do something a little bit more in the short term, a little bit more immediate, if we want to focus our efforts on something more long term, then we have some options there to play with. And when we talk about the short and the long term, this is going to be a nice segue into sort of operations closure and post-closure. So again, this is something that's very important to us, and it is something that we are implementing during the operation right now, post-closure and well into the future after the operation is long gone. So how are we doing this? Well, we do have the adaptive management approach where we can, again, continue our monitoring and research results, and that's going to be used to help improve compensation and mitigation efforts moving forward. So we continue gathering that information to get a sense of whether what we're doing is working or not. monitoring caribou and the habitat restoration. So we are going to be continuing those aerial surveys. We are gearing up to be kicking off another telemetry collaring program, which is really exciting. So we are going to be continuing those moving forward. And that's going to continue building that database and give us more information on movement behavior. So again, are caribou avoiding certain areas? Are they avoiding the mine site? And how they are responding to what we're doing in terms of reclamation. So are they favoring these areas or are they avoiding them as well? It'll give us an idea of cumulative impacts, so whether there's habitat fragmentation and what that means moving forward, and also some information on landscape connectivity. So there's really a lot of good information that's coming out of the monitoring programs, and this information is going to be directly feeding into this next segue slide, so another case study slide, which is setting our objectives for closure. So here at DLM, we do have a very comprehensive and ongoing post-closure monitor, post-closure planning program. So this beautiful mosaic here that you can see on the slide, the Detour Lake Mine is located in and around here. What you're looking at is the ecotypes, at least the ecotypes of the area pre-development. So this was all mapped out, and really this information is crucial to us because our closure objectives really are to return the lands back to as close as pre-development as possible and as practical. So this is part of our approach when we're talking about closure and progressive reclamation. We do want to, of course, create habitat for native species, and in this context, we can think about caribou, or we can think about any of the other species that call this area home. And another important consideration or sort of key point for us is that we do want the land to be safe, and we do want it to be available for traditional and also economic use. So we do want to provide this land back to the communities that utilize the land and would get the most benefit from it. So as you can see here, the ecotypes in the area were mapped prior to development. And then future ecotypes were projected, and we'll see that on the next slide, based on soil, climate, and vegetation conditions. So what you're looking at here is our post-closure concept, or also what we call our end land use plan. So here is a legend on the right-hand side to give a sense of what kind of ecotypes we're anticipating within certain sections or areas of the mine. So again, at the end of the day, literally, this is what we're hoping for, and this is what we're anticipating in terms of each of the areas. And we have given, or we have at least modeled out certain prescriptions in terms of ecotypes that we can anticipate on the features of the site. So some of our low-grade ore stockpiles will be consumed during the mine operation. We are anticipating full closure of some of our mine rock waste piles. And then some of them will be partially closed depending on whether they're nag or peg, and then reseeded accordingly. So because we have a good understanding of this particular closure concept today and what we want to achieve, now we can focus our efforts on working toward that via our progressive reclamation program. So we can focus on getting there today instead of waiting until the end of the day or waiting for closure. And this is really where our progressive reclamation program comes into play. So this is something, our research and progressive reclamation program, this is something that is near and dear to all of our hearts. And the reason that we do it is, it's multiple fold, but one of the key ones is that it does increase certainty that the reclamation methods that we're proposing and that we want to move forward with are effective and that they're going to work long term. So it does, and it also decreases the amount of work at final closure, because you don't want to be reclaiming, if you know what I mean. This is something that we do on a cyclical annual basis, and it is incorporated into the life of mine plan. So it's not something that is discussed about whether it's happening or not. It is a consideration that is built in right into the bones of our operation. Now, the DLM does have a lot of really exciting research going on, and this particular slide we could talk about for hours on end, but I'm going to skim through it quickly for the sake of time. But we do have, in terms of our native plant revegetation program, we have almost 5 years of research on the revegetation of the mine, specifically the mine till with native plants, which is fantastic. We have set up a tailings revegetation trial, which are these two pictures here. To get a better sense of what the best method could be to revegetate tailings. So of course, tailings is a byproduct of our operation, and we need to treat them with the utmost care. We also have this lichen and biological crust restoration program. So this is, it's fascinating work. So the goal of this research program is to learn how we can transplant and grow lichen and soils and those biological crusts in some of our restoration areas in order to create caribou habitat. So caribou love lichen, and we're learning that lichen is a little bit difficult to grow in lab settings. So we're really working on how we can fine tune that moving forward. And on the left-hand side here, this is one of our major progressive reclamation programs, at least in terms of size. So what you're looking at here is the test cover program, which is where we do just that. We have tailings areas where we test program, and we put you know, a native seed and certain prescriptions in terms of covers down. And it does give us a better sense of how we can reclaim tailings progressively and how we can change that prescription and tweak it moving forward into the future. And we are very proud to say that Detour Lake Mine did win the Tom Peters Memorial Mine Reclamation Award in 2020. And this is awarded by the Canadian Land Reclamation Association in recognition of achievements in the practice of mine reclamation. So this was gifted to us last year due to that tailings reclamation trial that I was talking about. So we have committed to reclaiming a minimum 10 hectares of tailings every year. This year we're on track to almost double that. Now I have a really quick video for you here. So all of this closure and tailings work is fantastic, but this video is really showing that closure concept in real time. So everything from topography to water elevation to the plants that you see here, these aren't just generated video plants that we threw in for a video for fun. These are the actual ecotypes that we are anticipating in this area come closure. So what you're looking at is really what we anticipate at the end of the day. So as we're panning to the left, this is our MRS1 stockpile. So going to be a beautiful feature in the landscape. So it does give you a sense that these things can be, you know, forecasted and mapped out, and it's something that we're really proud to show. And it is a, you know, it's a point of interest and collaboration with our Indigenous communities as well. So this is something that we like to show to say, you know, this is what we're proposing giving back at the end of the day. And I'm thinking that I may have to pause it in order to move forward. Here we go. And last but not least, I know that the main focus of our chat today was on our Detour Lake mine site because there's a lot of really exciting things going on, but the buck doesn't stop there. There's a lot of interesting efforts that are happening across our other sites and our other operations. So at our Macassa mine, we are working on a black bear wildlife management program, which is really a training program to inform the workforce about how to work safely in black bear country. We've kicked off a ghost bat monitoring program at our Northern Territory operations in Australia. So ghost bats have taken up residency in some of our historical mine features. So we do have to come up with a very, very solid plan that only protects the population, but allows us to work to mitigate and close out some of those features simultaneously or together. And then on the topic of bats, so we are working on a brown bat house trial here at DLM. So we are trialing right now both 2 and 4 chamber condos, and we're hoping that we can roll this out as a bit of a workshop for our employees to get them engaged and really working with biodiversity. And it's something that we hope that we can move forward with in the future. So with that, that is our discussion today. So thank you so much for having me, and I hope that you enjoyed the discussion regarding Kirkland Lake Gold and some of the biodiversity efforts that we're undertaking.
That was great. Thank you, Natasha. It's really interesting to hear about the work you're doing with respect to the woodland caribou monitoring and habitat restoration. Just seeing if there's any questions in the box there. I don't see any, but I do have a quick question for you, actually. What is in your opinion, one of the biggest challenges the mining industry faces with respect to incorporating biodiversity initiatives, either during operations or in your closure plans?
I think that one of the challenges that the mining industry faces, you know, it's less internal and I think it's more external. So I think that the mining industry may carry a little bit of a vintage reputation, that we either aren't progressive when it comes to some of these initiatives, that we may be lagging in terms of technology, and I think that that's certainly not the case. And another thing that I think that we're maybe not especially great at is bragging about the good work that we do. So I think that a lot of this stuff is really, when we dive in and look at the mining industry, there's a lot of really good work going on, but a lot of people just don't know about it. So I think that Exposure and communication is probably one of the key things that faces the mining industry. You know, there are a lot of regulations and frameworks that do help the mining industry move along in terms of biodiversity efforts, but it's really going above and beyond and getting that recognition and you know, sharing these stories. So these kinds of platforms and these kinds of opportunities are really great to get the word out that these things are happening, and even some of that cross-pollination between industries to share stories and see where we can collaborate together.
Great, thank you. So next up, we're going to turn it back over to Ashley Fox, and Ashley's going to provide an example of driving biodiversity using OPG as a case study. Over to you, Ashley.
Perfect, thank you. I'm just gonna have, we're gonna move the slide over. I'm wondering, I'm looking at our agenda and I thought it was Rob actually first and then me. So is that, yeah, that looks like, okay. So we're gonna do Rob first and then I'm gonna speak after that. So Rob Campbell, welcome. So he is here to discuss setting the standard for corporate biodiversity impact. And Rob is a senior manager of conservation strategies at the Wildlife Habitat Council, WHC. And he works closely with an array of member companies to deliver targeted products and services aimed to supporting each company's pursuit of unique sustainability goals. So in Rob's role, he serves as a liaison to member representatives across the industry sectors, and keeping them appraised of the information relative to their company's initiatives. So welcome, Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley, and a very interesting example, Natasha. I don't get to see woodland caribou too often, but I may need to make a point of doing so in the future. So now is kind of an extension of Margaret's opening session. I wanted to provide a brief introduction to the conservation framework that WHC has produced called Conservation Certification. So we'll take just a second to advance this first slide. Okay. So for just a bit of background on Wildlife Habitat Council and really our evolution over the years to provide industry with a framework that both guides them and compels them to take meaningful steps in promoting biodiversity on their properties and really extending that message into their local community. So we were founded about 23 years ago by a small group of companies like ExxonMobil, US Steel, Dow Chemical Company, really to support conservation work at their facilities. And just 2 years later, we awarded the first certification verifying those efforts at their facilities. You know, at that point, with expanding interest from our member companies, by 1994, we offered 2 parallel certification programs. Wildlife at Work, which recognized on-the-ground wildlife conservation efforts, and then also Corporate Lands for Learning, which provided incentives for companies to add an educational component to their efforts, whether it was with local schools or youth groups or even their own employees at the site. So these 2 frameworks operated in parallel for nearly 2 decades, during which time we saw significant advancements in conservation techniques and technologies. So we knew we were due for an overhaul of our certification standard. Over the next few years, we took the time to really reimagine how we as an environmental NGO could compel companies globally to rethink their approach to biodiversity across their land holdings and take meaningful action to preserve, restore, and create habitat for the native plants and animals in their area. And in 2016, we launched our conservation certification, which recognizes conservation actions and education elements really in their entirety. Today and currently, we continually assess the conservation landscape to ensure our framework supports actions on the most pressing conservation issues we face today, such as climate change, as Margaret had mentioned. So I know there's several companies here today which are OSSGA members and as such are from the construction materials sector, which we currently work with several of those companies, as you can see here from logos of many of our members in that industry. But the WHC model is equally applicable to other industry sectors like energy. OPG obviously is one of our great members, companies from that sector, oil and gas, automotives, chemical manufacturing, and waste management, which really is reflected in the makeup of our membership as it stands today. So while it was much needed, producing a framework that allows companies across industry sectors to participate is not an easy task. We knew it had to set clear design principles. So for instance, we knew first and foremost that the framework had to be credible, right? The standard needed to ensure that ecological needs are being met. So we convened advisory groups of outside experts and integrated their input with our own experience. We also knew that it had to be accessible, so providing guidelines to only companies operating on a massive footprint would severely limit participation in the framework. We, of course, wanted to identify existing gaps of our previous certification. So the certification needed to recognize efforts across ecosystems, species, and geographies. It has to produce verifiable metrics, which Joseanne will talk about in a little bit, both for individual sites and across a company's entire participating portfolio. So, and last but not least, there needed to be a platform to aid each team's participation in the framework and allow them to submit documentation of their actions easily. In the end, we were able to set a new standard that, again, was informed by external experts in their field who helped us identify the minimum necessary requirements for any conservation effort to have real positive impacts to biodiversity and the surrounding community. The standard awards companies biodiversity efforts looking at several criteria related to how they designed the project and are actively managing their project. And there, to build new tools and to support this new standard, we obviously had to stand up a few new tools. So we modernized our system to receive applications online so that multiple team members could contribute at any time. And in conjunction with that website, we stood up a certification support center to also help our applicants better navigate the certification process. And currently, we're working on integrating project monitoring tools for those that wish to use them. So now that I've told you a bit more about the process of producing the certification framework, I thought we might take a brief look at the structure of the framework itself. So as you can imagine, the basic building block of a biodiversity program is managing your lands to be productive habitats for wildlife. So we've defined 8 habitats that cover the vast majority of project locations. So these include cave habitats, deserts, forest, grasslands, landscaped habitats, marine intertidal, rocky areas, and wetlands. But conservation certification also offers an other habitats project category to capture efforts taking place in those less common habitats like dune and swale or shrubland. Next, excuse me, if you're kind of unable, to manage a habitat in its entirety, it's certainly okay that you also have the option to manage a single species like monarch butterfly that Margaret had mentioned, or even a group of species like pollinators as a whole. So again, the framework allows companies to focus their conservation efforts on a number of different species categories, as you can see here, and has that other species category for work with species that do not have a designated category, such as fish or non-pollinating insects. And as I mentioned previously, the framework recognizes the value in training and educating others on locally relevant biodiversity topics. So they too can become more knowledgeable about the conservation needs of the area and aware of the work taking place in their local communities. So we have 3 primary categories in which those education efforts take place. And then not to be overlooked, because most biodiversity actions are captured in the 3 previous categories, we felt that it was important to be able to capture other beneficial efforts like things like land conservation agreements, installation of green infrastructure, and biodiversity considerations made throughout the site's remediation efforts. So those are captured in the certification's other options category. So we went through kind of the different categories of recognition, which are all under the umbrella of a single program, which is the entity that that we certify through conservation certification. But here are kind of the results of our research and internal development of what is required if a project is going to be meaningful and should be deserving of recognition. So in general, there are 5 requirements, and of course these change slightly depending on which type of project you're talking about. But first and foremost, the project must be locally appropriate. So you're targeting species native, promoting species native to your region, or eliminating species that are non-native and invasive. So is it locally appropriate? Are you planting those native plants? Secondly, does the project go above and beyond regulatory requirements? So we wanted to recognize efforts that that companies had to do, that companies did not have to do, excuse me, that were voluntary or exceeded the pertinent permit requirement. Thirdly, does the project have at least one stated conservation or education objective? While this is kind of an easy box to check in the application, I argue that it's possibly the most important because without a clear objective, you don't know what you're aiming for, so it's difficult to make project management decisions. Fourth, is the project designed to provide value or benefit to the natural community? So that comes down to things like it has to be large enough to operate as a habitat type. You can't plant 3 trees and call it a forest, right? And it has to be on the ground long enough. Typically, 1 year is the rule of thumb before it can be recognized. And lastly, and also important, is the project supported by documentation of measurable outcomes. And so this comes down largely to monitoring your habitats, monitoring for species that you're managing for, or evaluating your education efforts. And just for a quick visual, this is the website that we developed that I had mentioned. So applicants are able to go into the conservation certification website long before they apply and lay out their objectives for their projects and update, as they do things on the ground, update those actions in here. So, really we like to think of it not as an application website, but really a work management tool that several people can use, much like SharePoint, give user permissions to others on the team. So this is all well and good, but if it's not being used, is it, what kind of value is it really providing? So, as you can see here by some of these statements, it is currently being utilized, our certification and the framework, by companies in 21 different countries across 638 individual sites. And at those sites, 1,545 projects have met the minimum standards laid out by the certification. So a subset of those numbers are, we actually have 41 of those 638 certified programs occur in Canada, and 28 of those 41 are actually located in the province of Ontario. And as you can see here left on this kind of colorful life cycle wheel, these are the steps that each of those teams are essentially going through in their biodiversity program journey. So from the initial steps of design and planning the program, to actually getting on the ground and implementing their program, to maintaining and monitoring and documenting what they're doing. All of these listed here obviously have applied for certification, were awarded certification. And then a step that some folks unfortunately overlook, and we as an organization certainly try to help our members with this, is communicating and storytelling about the efforts, because it's not only tooting your own horn, but in many cases, it leads to additional biodiversity conservation action when others in the community hear about it, have their own ideas, and connect your work to what else is taking place in the community. And then last but not least, and this kind of sets our award-winning programs apart from the others, is adaptive management. So really taking a look at those monitoring results and making project management decisions based on what you're seeing on the ground. So just very quickly, programs that apply are awarded one of 3 certification tiers, from WHC certified to certified silver and certified gold. So that is a 3-year certification term for gold and 2 for the other 2. So I thought to kind of ground truth this once again, and we're gonna hear some great examples from Ashley Fox here in a moment, but just to kind of give a couple of case studies with a company that everyone's familiar with. I want to talk about Toyota's Cambridge plant, which is based in Cambridge, Ontario. I'm sure you're familiar, but it's about 60 miles west of Toronto. They are a certified gold program. And at that site, they've set aside about 12 hectares of grassland habitat for bird conservation and support pollinator species like the monarch butterfly and also American lady butterfly. In addition to that grassland, they've installed native pollinator-friendly landscaping near the plant, which is excellent, and remove invasive species in those landscape beds like periwinkle and English ivy that continue to grow. Beyond their pollinator work, they've installed 6 nest boxes for cavity nesting songbirds and are partnering with the Ontario Eastern Bluebird Society. The team educates employees and visitors about this biodiversity and pollinators through on-site signage and various education events. So, for instance, I believe in 2018, they held a bee box building workshop, say that 10 times quickly, and also during that workshop distributed about 7 pounds of native pollinator seeds. So employees and other attendees could take those seeds home and plant pollinator habitat at their home location as well. So kind of keeping with the theme of Toyota, and much like their plant in Cambridge, Toyota has developed a conservation program at their 800-hectare manufacturing facility down in the US in San Antonio, Texas. And much like the Cambridge team, they've installed extensive native grasslands for the benefits of birds and pollinators, but they're tackling issues that are very locally relevant to them. And that's kind of the key in these programs, is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really looking at what are the issues and conservation priorities in your locale, and what can you do to address those. So to preserve the on-site habitat, they, and again, this is very local to Texas, but they trap feral hogs throughout the property, which, believe it or not, cause an estimated $50 million of damage across the state each year. So, they wreak havoc on a lot of native habitats and destroying those. So in conjunction with controlling the invasive species, the team is also working closely with the San Antonio Zoo to reintroduce this protected horned lizard, which you see a photo on the slide here, a little cute guy. And starting in 2019, the team also invited local primary school students to visit the site to see the work they're doing and to learn about the importance of local pollinators to the environment and to human health and wellness. So as you can see, the same company has successfully implemented biodiversity at not only these 2 locations, but an additional 15 locations across their footprint in North America. And each of those sites there's some commonalities, but they're doing conservation work that's pertinent to their location. So I know my time is running short here, so I just wanted to thank you, and I look forward to hearing from our next presenter, Ashley Fox from OPG, who's oversees several of their company's high-quality biodiversity programs. So thanks for having me here today.
Thank you, Rob. That was really great. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but Rob, before you go, I did have one question for you. If a company was considering certification, what do you think is going to be their biggest challenge, and what is your advice to overcoming that challenge?
Sure. So the biggest, I would say the biggest challenge is probably narrowing down from the realm of infinite possibilities of what they could be doing at their site to something that is meaningful to their location. So I jokingly and not so jokingly often refer to a pollinator garden as kind of a gateway project. So one of the challenges there is just get started. These programs are malleable. They grow and change over time. So don't feel like you have to have all the answers to get started in your conservation journey and your certification journey. The certification recognizes smaller efforts like individual pollinator gardens and large scale landscape level efforts as well. So that would be my advice is just get started, start talking to people both at the site and potential expert partners in your area, and engage with, we have a ton of freely available webinars and things like that that folks can take advantage of at any time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so I am up next. So I'm going to have a little bit of help switching my slides. So perfect. Thank you. Alrighty, so as mentioned, I work for OPG, and this is a super quick mini 5-minute presentation about OPG's biodiversity conservation partnership with South Nation Conservation Authority and the collaborative partnerships between the Algonquin and Mohawk nations in Eastern Ontario. So the project is called The Healing Place. Next slide, please. Okay, a lot of people think that OPG just generates electricity, but I am here to dispel the myth that we actually do a lot more than that. So we aim to harmonize our operations with people and nature. So we've recently released a public-facing climate change plan. And tied to that is a commitment to work collaboratively to propel biodiversity initiatives in our host communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so OPG has a large amount of biodiversity conservation projects on the go every year. Some are on our sites and some are off our sites with different partners. So this is an off-site program. And it's of particular interest because of its significant input from our First Nation partners near our Moses Saunders Dam in Cornwall, near Shanley, Ontario. So the Healing Place is what this project is called, and it's a community green space located on the traditional territories of the Algonquin and Mohawk nations. And it was created in the fall of 2020 through a reconciliation and climate change planting event planned through collaborative partnerships with South Nation Conservation Authority. So essentially, OPG has provided funding. We have reached out to South Nation Conservation Authority to get all of the people at the table and to ask our First Nations partners, what do you really need in this area? And this was the idea that they had proposed, the Healing Place. So the purpose of the Healing Place is essentially to create meaningful partnerships with Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in a restorative process to create physical places of healing while at the same time cultivating safe, ethical spaces and, of course, increasing biodiversity. Next slide. Okay, it was suggested to create a medicine wheel design, as you can see on the left picture, by planting trees and edible shrubs. In the diagram, we have the 4 pillars of life, which are essentially the 4 cardinal directions. So north, south, east, and west, which represent the mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical connections of humans and the land. And the picture on the right shows all of the wonderful volunteers who helped with the planting. So next slide. And of course, our goal was to harmonize with people and harmonize with nature. And so the medicinal herbs and berries that we planted were strawberries, raspberries, red and white currants, and they were planted in the center of the site. And then we also planted um, the edible shrubs, and what they did was that they naturally incorporated endangered tree species and keystone species into the medicine wheel design, and that ultimately promotes biodiversity. So the amount of listening, learning, and participation of our teams was hugely informative. And so now we're actually looking to create this exact design, this healing place at our new corporate campus, which is coming up in Durham in 2024. So we've taken this design and just duplicated it over there because we loved the process, we loved the people. It was just a fantastic partnership. So the point of my presentation is essentially to encourage you to consider these types of partnerships. Reach out to First Nations, your conservation authorities, and just ask them, you know, what do you need in this area and how can we partner with you? So essentially the goal is to figure out how is this going to be win-win for everyone and move forward with the plan. So next slide. I've listed here the benefits of the partnership. So this took months and months to plan and organize and get together, but in the process, we were able to learn about each other's needs, and that really demonstrated where we can direct our resources. So it felt like we were actually moving forward in a direction that was mutually beneficial. And we were able to hear other success stories. So what actually works in the real world and on the ground and for people in our communities, and incorporating new ideas, because I run the biodiversity conservation program at OPG and I don't have all the answers or all the ideas. So getting more people together at the table to communicate was amazing. And of course, growing and learning together was our priority. And then on the other side, harmonizing with nature, on a practical side, increasing native and edible species in the local area. Of course, it's free for people to come and take sustainably as they need it. We are reducing invasive species at the same time. Of course, increase carbon capture, erosion control, and nitrogen fixation. And last slide, that is it for me. Quick mini 5 minutes presentation on that project. So if you do have more questions about that or want to reach out to me for any reason, my information is just here on this slide, and I'm happy to speak with you or email back and forth about some details. So, Ashley, I believe we are on a break.
We are. We're a little bit behind schedule, but we have a 5-minute break at this point, so we can stretch and grab some coffee. So why don't we say we meet back here 10:37 now. Let's say 10:43. We'll give you an extra minute.
Perfect. Okay, sounds like a plan.
All right, we'll see everyone in a little bit.
Everybody's back online. Welcome back. Had a quick little break. Alrighty, so our next session for mainstreaming biodiversity within business is Josiane Bonneau. And so Josiane, since joining Wildlife Habitat Council in 2005, Josiane has occupied various positions within the organization as biologist, director of field programs, senior director, conservation strategy and planning, and currently Chief Operating Officer and Biodiversity Practice Lead. So Josiane focuses on the development of mechanisms and launch of industry strategies for corporations to embrace conservation as a tried and tested business value. So welcome, Josiane.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I feel like this morning's presenters have set the perfect stage for me to discuss one of the important benefits of engaging in biodiversity beyond the support of nature, and that's the ability to share an incredibly compelling story externally. So you'll be familiar with the C-Suite 16 by now. Margaret shared it earlier. I bring it back here because storytelling and data sharing, it really is at the center of about a third of the drivers of corporate conservation. In implementing ecologically and locally meaningful biodiversity projects, we all know that it's pretty standard to collect data related to efforts and outcomes. And that really is the piece that opens the door to a suite of communication channels supporting social license to operate, a more positive permitting experience, impressive sustainability and ESG reporting, and a deeper stakeholder engagement, very much aligned with Natasha's presentation and concluding statements earlier. So with that in mind, we'll dig a little deeper into data today, specifically how data changes based on the maturity stage of a conservation approach, but also based on its characteristics. And then we'll review ways to leverage data in sustainability reporting and in the context of stakeholder alignments. And if I have time, I do want to talk about some trends and changes that we're seeing on the horizon. So in the past 30 plus years now, how businesses in North America think about biodiversity has evolved. And the way a business considers biodiversity in turn influences the data and the metrics that it typically will set out to collect and report. So for companies that are mostly concerned about footprint and biodiversity impacts, negative impacts, we typically anticipate data related to area, right? So size of buffer land, changes in permeable areas, hectares restored, extent of habitat that is used by listed species that is being impacted, kind of those types of metrics. And the focus is generally on the negative impacts and how the impacts are being managed. For the companies that are transitioning to thinking of risks and materiality, again, related to biodiversity, we see the addition of data on avoidance actions, mechanisms developed, habitat and biodiversity policies in place for the company, but also for the supply chain. We see proximity to sensitive area being measured and reported, awareness, training efforts, stakeholder collaboration. So we really start to see a focus on not just species and habitats, but functions like pollination, climate adaptation, and connectivity. For the companies engaging under a mainstreaming intent, it's not unusual to see parallel tracks of biodiversity efforts emerge. So one track that continues to address risks and materiality, while another track starts to integrate biodiversity consideration in EMS, in capital projects, and employee engagement and recruitment. So the data becomes about practices and their results. So we see a lot of data points related to projects and people, hours, species, diversities, number of communities engaged, number of people touched by some of the project. And in the past decade or so, the positive outcome angle has certainly gained popularity The mining sector has been an important positive influence with the concepts of no net loss and net positive impacts, but beyond the catchy terms, more and more businesses are wanting to do the right thing, to really do what they can to contribute to the solution to, quite frankly, two of the many global crises we face, the biodiversity and the climate crises. So the metrics in that case are rather different. They're focused on biodiversity uplift, on contributions to priorities, and they're very much influenced by the conservation world rather than typical business performance indicators that we see in other sectors. So just as there's no good or bad stages of maturity, companies are, approaching it in the way they choose. There's no single route to approaching biodiversity and generating data that can be leveraged. Across the three common approaches, whether strategic, tactical, or grassroots, if there's a clear objective, right, a vision of what success looks like, then the compatible projects will fall in place to achieve goals and generate the data needed to maximize the return on investment. And the reason I bring this up is really simple. One of the questions we frequently answer is about whether or not it's too late to strive for impactful storytelling if a business engagement has mostly been grassroots or perhaps ad hoc, or if the engagement was started in a truly reactive manner many years ago. And the answer is always, no, it's never too late. Any business can tweak or right-size their efforts to meet the desired narrative. And most of the time, it really isn't even about changing a project. It's usually just about changing the objective. So a conservation or business objective paired with a biodiversity project leads to data, wonderful data. I personally love data. Maybe even certification data comes out of it. But realistically, biodiversity in businesses leads to data opportunities, but also data challenges. So 4 aspects to keep in mind to navigate storytelling and reporting seamlessly in the business context. First, telling your biodiversity journey can be qualitative or really, it can be quantitative. Your data can be generated by experts, it can be generated by volunteers. Citizen science is respected when consistently approached, and methodologies exist for a wide range of knowledge levels. So pick what makes sense and review it periodically. But whatever you do, and I think it goes to some of what Rob talked about, whatever you do collect information. The other aspect of data is that your biodiversity efforts have relevance in a context, and that context is a context of scale, but also a sense of place. For example, the installation of bluebird boxes can be looked at as insufficient in a community, but be praised in another. Or let's say the restoration of 5 hectares of forest, will be a massive achievement for a manufacturing plant, but completely go unnoticed at the regional level. So objectives, projects, data, narrative kind of need to be aligned depending on the regional context, on the scale context, but also based on the audience. So speaking of audience, really know who you want to reach, which group, which individual is the ultimate target of the message. You're probably going to have many different answers if you put 4 of your colleagues in a room, socially distanced, of course, and you ask them what they think is the ultimate stakeholder or ultimate audience for biodiversity. They'll have different answers, but that's really not a problem. Biodiversity projects have multiple angles, but if you don't know who will be listening, it becomes really hard to share the message in the correct language. So one of my favorite examples is a power line transmission corridor. So imagine that in your head, right? The big pylons. Typically, those rights of ways are managed to exclude tall, woody vegetation. And usually that right of way then results in a really nice grassland habitat, an early successional habitat, which is perfect for ground nesting birds. And more often than not, non-native invasive species will also be controlled, increasing the diversity of plants and offering habitat that's valuable to pollinators and other insects. So a habitat managed that way is, on top of everything, more stable, requires less interventions, and will typically see a reduced use of gas-powered machinery. So just by working to meet reliability needs, a utility can tell the bird people, the pollinator people, the climate stakeholders about their positive impact, right? With that one project, many angles. So that's really interesting to maximize your return on investment in your efforts for biodiversity. So let's focus on reporting for a few minutes. Sustainability and ESG reporting have been really a true friend to biodiversity over the years. The pressures that businesses feel to report on sustainability through different mechanisms, and those mechanisms sometimes include biodiversity, really drives action and influences what's being done. So it serves as a trigger of activity in several industry sectors and also a trigger for several individual businesses. So there's 3 aspects of reporting, sustainability reporting, that I feel influenced your biodiversity narrative. And those are tools, criteria, and measures. So there's 3 types of reporting tools out there that you've probably come across. So the first one is frameworks. And those are principles, initiatives, or guidelines assisting in disclosure efforts. GRI is one of those. And then you have standards. Those are in the form of formal documentation specifying requirements to ensure consistent achievement of sustainability. And then you'll have ratings or indices, which are the third-party evaluation of a corporation's sustainability performance. So think Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And across those 3 types of tools to tell a story, there are 52 options of tools that directly apply to Canadian businesses. So you can imagine it's really not always easy to select the one that is best suited to tell your story in the most effective way. So each tool contains questions or criteria or elements that are being evaluated, and only a handful of those 52 tools have a clear, direct question about biodiversity efforts that go beyond the reporting of negative impact, right? Anyone can ask about your negative impacts, but a lot of the Canadian businesses, and particularly in Ontario, are doing really cool positive things, not in reaction to an impact. So the questions are rarely specific and quantifiable. In most instances, the biodiversity questions are presented with subjective questions. And the disadvantage of those qualitative questions and answers is that it becomes really difficult, and actually probably nearly impossible, to benchmark. And in the business sector, knowing if your competitors are leading in biodiversity commitments and positive impacts would certainly be an added driver of adoption and make probably your life easier to get leadership to agree to invest and engage in biodiversity. But on the other hand, the advantage of qualitative questions like those is the flexibility. You can use any data or narrative, right? You can basically answer in any way you desire. So dozens and dozens of businesses choose to use a proxy metric that is third-party verified, very much like the WHC conservation certification, but there's a plethora of others, to improve the robustness of their disclosures. And we're seeing also a rapid evolution in the biodiversity practices that are deployed by businesses. And I think we had some really good examples today already. And the reporting questions and revision processes, however, can't quite keep up. So as a result, there's a marked disconnect between the innovations we see on the ground from businesses and what's actually publicly reported through sustainability tool. So really that doesn't quite line up. So because of that disconnect, we're seeing companies starting to look beyond the biodiversity sections of the tools for opportunities to showcase their biodiversity commitments and their work. Areas related to community engagement, tribal relations, carbon reduction, climate resiliency, diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of those are options to consider as platforms to tell your biodiversity story, because nature is so intricately linked to people and to climate. So the scope of my chat today doesn't provide us enough time to dive into specific measures and methods, that third aspect. But what I can share is that there's continued controversy around the need or not for kind of this one big metric or measure, this apex measurement to be deployed for businesses to report on biodiversity. And fortunately, the conversation is increasingly led by pragmatic academics, NGOs like the WHC and trade associations, really looking for a science-based yet like really practical solution. So I mentioned a few examples of biodiversity reporting tools. The Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, under Section 304, asks biodiversity-related questions. There's been an update in their 2016 version where they started calling out biodiversity impacts specifically as both negative and positive, which truly opened the door to narratives related to contributions to nature, to biodiversity uplift, to finally be included in the reports. The CDP has a few questions in their climate change questionnaire that are compatible with showcasing some biodiversity efforts. It takes a bit of creativity to fit it in, but their forest questionnaire offers a lot more options. The Dow Jones Sustainability Index has been adding biodiversity questions in the past couple of years to a few of their industry-specific methodologies. So they're not doing it blanket, across all of their different questionnaires, but we're seeing this as a trend and anticipate that it's going to continue in the future, that more and more of those biodiversity questions will make their way to the questionnaires. And finally, I wanted to highlight and link back to Margaret's presentation, the United Nations SDGs. Businesses, of course, can pledge their commitments, but they can also report on their efforts through the Global Compact. Goal 15 really matches well with biodiversity, and some of the reporting platforms are becoming increasingly available specifically to share your progress on the SDGs. So I'm going to shift just a little bit. The second big option to leverage data is using alignments. And what I mean by alignment is basically aligning your biodiversity efforts with local, regional, national, and global priorities. This is really key for storytelling with stakeholders that are not embedded into business on a day-to-day basis. And it's good for those stakeholders that are not your investors. Alignments offer absolutely endless possibilities. They're one of my favorite tools to maximize storytelling and maximize benefits when I'm working with any of our companies. And for any given location, wherever you're sitting today, I absolutely can assure you that there are multiple layers of priorities to align with, resulting in an instant amplification of efforts that really shouldn't be underestimated. So if we think back about the transmission right-of-way example that I shared earlier, we had these multiple benefits that could be identified in that one project. And if this right-of-way was in Ontario, a utility could likely identify that its biodiversity efforts support the Regional Conservation Authority's goal for managing invasive species, because that's common in most of them. Of course, it would support the Ontario Biodiversity Strategy. It would also support the North American Bird Conservation Initiative in Canada and Ontario's Pollinator Health Action Plan. And this is just a few examples. I'm sure we could find additional layers depending on the scale that the efforts could align with. So investing time in actually identifying these alignments during the design and planning process of any biodiversity project has added benefits, you know, versus doing it at the end or through the project, because it can provide guidance for implementation, maintenance, monitoring. It may even be a good way to identify partners and connect with stakeholders that share similar interests. And I really like alignments because they're not static. So they can be reviewed periodically. So your story, even though your projects are stable, your story can change, and it can be really exciting to think through how to leverage this over time. So you probably have recognized the Jefferson salamander here on the slide. It's actually one of Margaret's favorite example of alignment, and I stole it from her book a few days ago. I think it's page 63, if I'm not mistaken. CRH company, better known here in Ontario as Dufferin Aggregates, has been managing a population of Jefferson salamanders at their Milton limestone quarry for many, many years. And they've done so by adapting the progressive rehabilitation of their operations to suit the need of the needs, plural, of the species. And in doing so, CRH has formed really meaningful partnerships, and they've aligned their efforts with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry's Jefferson Salamander Recovery Plan. And it's also contributing to meeting the goals of Environment Climate Change Canada, and they're also contributing to the Ontario Biodiversity Strategy. So it's a really nice 3-4-1. And not only that, but the project is also prominently featured in the GRI reporting that CRH does, and it's also contributed positively to the company's score on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So, you know, we talk about potential to report through sustainability and also through alignments, but then both can also be done at the same time. So it really is a good example in that way. So with not many minutes to go, I'm just quickly going to mention that integrating biodiversity in business certainly is becoming increasingly accessible. There's a lot more help around than a few years ago. The next few years will bring a greater demand to integrate climate and biodiversity together, and we certainly foresee that that is going to take place within communities with a filter of climate equity and nature-based solutions that really we should be paying attention to. I'm anticipating that the demands on the supply chain when it comes to biodiversity commitments will certainly increase and become more common. But it's certainly possible to engage in biodiversity while minimizing risks to the business. And I really hope this morning's series of presentations will encourage you to consider that. Thank you.
Perfect, Josiane. Thank you so much. That was very informative. Any questions in our question box? Not seeing any right now. I did have one. So if a company was looking to get a better handle on these different reporting tools, do you know if there's a centralized place to like compare and contrast, you know, reporting on SDGs, GRI versus this, that, and the other?
This is going to be my physical answer. Yes, I really wish there was one. There isn't one that is really looking at all those different tools. You know, there's industry specific tools that are available, and usually those are a little better tuned in to the biodiversity needs of that particular industry sector. There's efforts right now at the UN level to bring together not necessarily the reporting, but the quantification measures and frameworks. So what can businesses use to quantify and to measure their biodiversity? So there's some really good kind of tabular comparison, and I can share a link. But not so much with the reporting tools. And it's really challenging because the narrative in the literature right now and across business sectors is, well, the businesses are not quite there yet. They're not really doing that much biodiversity. Look, we're looking at their GRI reports. They're really not that far along. So So maybe there isn't a need to do a big comparison of reporting tools and identify which ones are really great for biodiversity. But that's like a faulty reasoning, because the reason there isn't a lot of innovations reported is because the questions are not that great, right? So I think it's coming. Certainly there's a push in the EU for more transparency on biodiversity and disclosures. So yeah, I think it's coming. But if anyone has any questions and wondering, I have a ton of information about those 52 plus tools that are applicable to Canadian businesses.
Amazing. Yeah. So if you could drop that link into, I think it's going to be the question area. If it's not that, I'll pull it from there and put it in the right spot. But yeah, drop it there for us, and that would be wonderful. So thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we are moving on to the other half of the A team. Ashley Zellick, over to you.
Great, thanks, Ashley. There we go. Okay, so whether managing existing operations or planning the rehabilitation of pits and quarries, there exists a wide range of opportunities for the aggregate industry to contribute to the conservation and enhancement of Ontario's biodiversity. Now, having only a couple minutes, I hope to just highlight some of the ways that the aggregate industry is implementing nature-based solutions. So the creation of habitat is obviously possible through both offsetting and restoration, and the aggregate industry is actually a significant creator of wetland habitat. And we know that wetlands are one of the most productive and biologically diverse habitats in the world, and they remain an environmental and conservation priority within Ontario. And so in 2017, OSGA conducted a study that actually looked at surrendered sites, so those are sites from which they're now closed and rehab has been done within the provincial plan areas, and found that 293 hectares of aquatic habitat was created. And then in 2019, we looked at a subset of those sites and actually found that there was significant ecological diversity within those sites. And in fact, the photos that you see here were actually taken from those study sites. So just for example, a rare dragonfly species was found in small wetland pools that it adapted to survive in at Heber Downs. And a redneck grebe, a provincially rare nesting bird, was also found in one of the wetlands at Eagle's Nest. But it's not just surrendered sites that are contributing to preserving biodiversity. Active aggregate producers are as well. And so in recognition of the efforts that they're making towards biodiversity enhancement, in 2014, OSGA developed and launched a biodiversity award, which recognizes members for their contribution in going above and beyond standard industry practices and regulatory requirements. And actually, Ontario's biodiversity strategy was central to the development of our award. And the award was also intended to raise public awareness of the positive impact that the industry can have on Ontario's biodiversity. And now, I know Chris will be speaking next about Lafarge's award-winning initiative, but I thought I'd just highlight a couple examples on the additional 2 slides. So our 2015 winner was St. Mary's, or CDM Aggregates. And St. Mary's maintained an aggregate extraction license for a 225-hectare quarry at a site near Bowmanville since 1963. And as part of the planned quarry development, part of the marsh was to be removed so that important resources could be extracted. But the company worked with Waterfront Regeneration Trust to develop a site plan that protected as much of the marsh as possible. And they then introduced a sampling program to promote growth of various species of fish. They conducted water quality testing, took aerial photos to pinpoint changes in biodiversity. They sought out opportunities to relocate pet species and build habitat structures. And in fact, the site is now home to a large group of osprey that now protect the marsh from unwanted birds. And the site remains in close contact with neighboring communities to ensure the ongoing health of the wetland. Another great example, in 2005, Wanco Limited, located in North Dumfries, was approached by the Waterloo Stewardship Network with a request to become a partner in enhancing one of Ontario's largest prairie remnants from the tallgrass prairies and savannas on its property. And soon after, a plan to regrow a Wanco prairie was launched. And over the last 10 years, the Wanco Rehabilitation Project has included prescribed burns, the creation of invasive species management plan, extensive seeding and planting, seed collection, and ongoing monitoring. And in fact, the site has been a focus of study for students from the University of Waterloo, and seeds collected from this area have contributed to the restoration of other prairie lands. Now, just switching gears a little bit, the Ontario Aggregate Resources Corporation, otherwise known as TORC, is responsible for the rehabilitation of abandoned sites, but they also undertake aggregate research. And one relevant example of their publication includes guidance for rehabilitation to maximize biodiversity value, which addresses species at risk at aggregate sites. And they also undertake research. So some of their research initiatives include looking at soil degradation, for example, but also studying the similarities between abandoned quarries and alvar habitats, aiming to determine which factors might limit the colonization of those species on abandoned quarry floors. And they also are looking at exploring opportunities to restore back to tallgrass prairies because of their already open nature of aggregate sites and their adaptability to management scenarios. So I wish I had more time, but my takeaway message is that the aggregate industry is well positioned to create nature-based solutions to the biodiversity crisis. And through partnerships, innovation, and research, the industry can help meet the goals of Ontario's biodiversity strategy. And so in closing, I just want to leave you with a short video of Dufferin Aggregates Milton Quarry, which highlights some of their rehabilitation initiatives. And this is actually the site that Josiane just mentioned with her Jefferson Salamander photo. Let's try that again. Bear with me, I'm just having a little bit of technical difficulties. There we go. So it looks like we were missing some audio for that video, but the video does showcase the great work that was done, and they talk about how this site has actually been redesignated within the Niagara Escarpment area because of the great rehab work that's being done, and some of the work they're doing with respect to monitoring species within the area, and you could see the short clip of the Jefferson Salamander there. Great, thanks everyone. So not seeing any questions in the question box there. I'll introduce our next speaker. So next up, we have Chris Galloway, and Chris is a senior land manager with Lafarge Canada, focusing on Lafarge's land assets in the East GTA. And Chris has been with Lafarge Land Group since 2007, managing Lafarge's land assets across Ontario. His work at Lafarge supports the aggregate concrete and cement product lines and includes acquiring and divesting lands, leading rehabilitation restoration projects at Lafarge's aggregate properties, licensing and permitting of new aggregate lands for Lafarge property taxes, as well as developing relationships with the communities Lafarge operates in.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Ashley, and thanks everyone for allowing me to talk today. And I think it's a great opportunity to really talk about, a lot of the efforts that industry in general has undertaken for rehabilitation and biodiversity efforts in and across Ontario. And I think, just reflecting on some of the comments that were said by some of the other speakers, Natasha made a great point about getting the industry message out. And I think, that there is, a lot of work that we as in the industry can do to get our messages out. And I'm just going to talk about one kind of small project, or one project that we have undertaken at our Uxbridge Regan pit. But we have multiple examples of projects which would be biodiversity projects across all of our properties and all of our product lines. Whether it be in our cement plants or cement quarries with small pollinator gardens, as well as bat habitats at some of our ready mix plants. It's a great opportunity to. We just need to do a better job at doing that. And I think back to, and Margaret made a point at the very beginning here to talk about our social license to operate, and I think it's important that we keep that in mind as industry and really look at these nature-based activities to as part of our operations and our restoration rehabilitation projects. And I think that this one I will quickly talk about. It does reach back on, Rob made a great point as well, is start out small and just get started. I think, just through the natural progression of these projects, I think the struggle with a lot of companies and industries is, where do we start? And I think it's just a matter of just starting somewhere and making those connections with people like Wildlife Habitat Council, or with groups, the Ontario Biodiversity Council, and just helping guide through that process, but just get started and move forward. So just to talk about the, bit of background about the Uxbridge pit. It's a pretty large, land assembly that we do have. It's 455 acres of land situated just south of the town of Uxbridge itself, and we are located right in the Oak Ridges Moraine. A little history of the site. We are pretty much done extraction at the site now. We have a little bit of aggregate reserves left there, but the site is now in its kind of final stages. We're disassembling the aggregate plant that's there, and rehabilitation efforts are taking place. The site was licensed back in the 70s, and we acquired that, or the Lafarge company acquired that back in 1984. And I think that's important to understand that early aggregate sites, there wasn't a lot of guidance around rehabilitation at that point in time. So it's been through changes in the Aggregate Resources Act or the Pits and Quarries Act prior to that, but also just efforts that companies are taking on to look at what we can do to restore something back that's going to have a positive or a benefit to the community that we do operate in. This site was critical, or was a key site in terms of providing high quality aggregates to the development and growth of the GTA, mainly around our concrete and asphalt, sand and stone. And we consider these to be premium qualities to really create a high quality product for condo development, infrastructure development, and stuff like that. And really, rehabilitation of this site has been a priority, and really started kind of just after we acquired the site. Just starting to get some of these slopes rehabilitated, creating a bit better landform than just a flat pit bottom, and creating kind of a agricultural land. These hummocky and rolly topography, and looking at tree reforestation efforts and stuff like that. And we're pretty proud of this site. And it's an opportunity to bring in whether it's community environmental groups to help with some projects there, or tours, to bring in school groups for tours to talk about the relationship between aggregates and the environment, and as well just to talk about some examples of good rehabilitation that we do undertake. So just a bit of a, I guess give a bit of a landscape view. We are surrounded. There are some aggregate sites that are in and around us there. The site, Regan Pit, is in the green. We do have to the east of us, that would be the North Durham Woods. We have Walker's Woods to the south, and Uxbridge, the township of Uxbridge, and the municipality have numerous trails throughout the property and surrounding the property, or around the property itself. So just an example of kind of how we're integrated into this very large tract of woodland there. And just kind of zooming in, you can see it was a fairly recent air photo that we've taken on the site, and to the east end, or sorry, to the west end of the site. That's really where a majority of our rehabilitation efforts have been focused on, and you can start to see some of the reforestation and plantings that we've taken on. So a bit about the geology of the site. This is located probably in the middle of the Oak Ridges Moraine, and I think most people are quite familiar with the Oak Ridges Moraine. It's a very large geological feature that extends from the Niagara Escarpment, approximately 100 kilometers to 160 kilometers east to Rice Lake. So it's a pretty big thing, and really, this is there are a lot of high quality aggregate deposits within the Oak Ridges Moraine, and it is one of the most important aggregate resources in the Durham region. And because of that importance for agriculture, or for aggregate, but also the environmental sensitivity of the Oak Ridges Moraine, we have to have that balance and look at our rehabilitation efforts to create that balance and to really reestablish some of that, some of those key ecological features there. And so Lafarge itself, we are the largest, construction material producer in the world. We operate in 70 different countries, and we have 70,000 employees worldwide. So very large producer here, and we do have an overarching biodiversity goals that come from our head corporate office. But I think it was also mentioned earlier on that biodiversity strategies are very complex, and it's important to have flexibility. And so, each kind of region or area, has that opportunity to be flexible and really tailor these plans that suit the needs for the particular areas that we're working on. And so in Eastern Canada, we really focus on creating these plans that have a nature positive impact on the local biodiversity, and really have, there's kind of 7 kind of key, areas or buckets that we focus in on to create this nature positive impact to those lands. And really they look at, around just, avoiding or minimizing the damage to important habitats. Controlling invasive species is a difficult one, but it's one that's important as well. We want to make sure that we're restoring or rehabilitating any of those damaged habitats that are kind of related to our activities. They make the industrial areas as natural as possible and try to integrate nature, and that also includes progressive rehabilitation when we're working along. We want to make sure that we're having a minimal impact or no impact to species mortality. Habitat fragmentation is always a key thing, and we want to make sure that we minimize that. And we want to really focus on just doing local native species as part of our planting and planting efforts. And I mean, I think a lot of the management plans, the concepts have been talked about in other presentations, so I won't really go through them in a lot of detail, but a lot of it focuses around, monitoring, measuring, and promotion. And I think that, those are kind of the key kind of things that we need to keep in mind as we move forward with these plans is, the measuring and the monitoring, just to understand the success of that, but also have the opportunity to promote these, get it out into the communities and let them know that what the efforts are we taking, and maybe that will allow for opportunities with partnerships with other groups within the communities as well. And really we want to, the communication, but also the engagement of people. We've heard that message as well, that we want to get local engagement. So we really, try to engage our local site personnel, whether it's scale house people, loader operators. We want them to take a sense of ownership to this as well, because the project doesn't succeed unless we have full ownership and a full engagement with our employees. And we do see that, and I know, speaking to other producers, that's kind of the same, goal that they want to have as well, is to really engage the local people to make sure that they're, that everybody sees the benefit and understands the benefit and makes it a successful project as well. And so really, I guess we want to talk about some of our efforts at the Regan pit, or the Uxbridge pit. And really where this started out was kind of our biodiversity plan was around reestablishing that forest corridor and the linkage between the woods to the north and to the south of us, and there was a big open gap. It was identified that just the movement of some of the species through there might have been very difficult and not favorable for that. So we worked with a local forestry company and arborists, and really helped us develop these plans to look at preferable species to plant, kind of planting, kind of strategy when we would plant certain areas. We did, it was a culmination of a bunch of different types of planting. We did mechanical planting, as you can see, with a machine behind a tractor. We also engaged lots of local, community groups. So Boy Scouts came out. We planted trees with the Boy Scouts, and we did a mixed variety of plantings as well. So, we looked at different type of pine, white pine, red pine. We had cedars. We looked at tamarack species and some poplar species as well, just to try to create a bit of a variety. And to date, we're actually upwards now of over 60,000 trees that we've planted in this corridor. And part of that program as well is the ongoing monitoring of that. So we do have our forest consultant they do go out on an annual basis. They do measurements. They look at survivability rates and just to make sure that what we're doing is working. And through some of the pictures that you can see, you can really start to see that we're getting some good growth, or some areas that are some gaps, and some of the challenges that we face here, kind of come around. We're starting to create a bit of this corridor for these animals to traverse, and the deer seem to like some of the cedar species that we're doing there, and so we're trying to come up with a plan to protect those trees so they don't it's not a buffet for these for the deer to come through. And the other challenge that we face as well is throughout the Oak Ridges Moraine, the overburden of topsoil is very thin, and so trying to have a layer of organic, an organic layer, I guess, to plant these trees in is becoming very challenging. Under the Aggregate Resources Act, we have to keep topsoil and subsoil on the site to use in our rehabilitation efforts. But just putting it back, we're finding that it's it does. There are certain areas which are more, I guess, arid and sandy, and so free draining, and we don't get that moisture retention. So we're looking at ways to combat that, and some of that is planting some of these more deciduous type trees within the coniferous trees. You get foliage drop, and hopefully then you can kind of create this biomass to help generate some organic layers in there. We're also looking at opportunities, if there is available topsoil that we can bring into the site. Again, it would be local stuff that we would want to make sure that it's, within several kilometers of the site, so that we're not introducing any, native seeds or invasive seeds to come in there. So, really, this is, the efforts that we've been taking. Like I said, we get the Boy Scouts coming out there. We've been actually going back since 2012 to having the Scouts come out, and it's a great opportunity for an education as well to introduce these kids. They have a great Trees for Canada program. I was a Boy Scout back in the day, planted many trees with that, and it's nice to have the young people come out and engage in that. And so once we kind of established the tree planting, though, this kind of morphed into the second kind of initiative that we undertake at the site, and it's with the North Durham Nature Club. And it was around Bluebird Box program that we put in there. And so, it's a pretty, 455 acres of land. It's a pretty open and wild area. And, through the club, they were able to come up and we helped them, with getting Bluebird boxes and installing them throughout the property. And they come in and do all the monitoring of the Bluebird boxes, looking at the nest occupancy rate, and provide us just with some feedback on that. We talked to them about, is there spaces where we could add more boxes? Can we, orientation of the boxes are also important, and we're starting to see that this is becoming a really, we can see that the rehabilitation efforts, we're starting to get more and more of these bird species that are coming and utilizing the site, and it's great to be able to utilize, some local knowledge and people, they have a great knowledge of the area and of uses around the site, and it's nice to be able to pull those people through and to keep this program moving. And again, then building off of that, we started trying to create these terrestrial habitats. Some of this, at the site, with our extraction work, there was some trees and tree stumps that were removed from the site so that we could access the aggregates. And we were trying to figure out what do we do with these piles of stumps, and we were able to create these kind of mounds or this terrestrial habitats, and we're starting to see some of the some species starting to utilize that for for their own habitat, and it's kind of great. And so we've got these kind of scattered across the floor of the pit, and to look at can we provide them with additional places to be, and again, building off of that as well was just to understand what species were actually utilizing some of these terrestrial habitats. So we created these track plates around the periphery of the site just to see if we could understand is it deer. Actually, we had deer, we had wild turkey, rabbits, all types of mammals that were coming on the site, and installing these track plates gave us the opportunity to, again, it was a measurement tool that we could see that these mammals were utilizing the site, and to be able to help measure the success of some of this habitat that we were creating. So I mean, that's in a nutshell some of the efforts that we've undertaken with the the Uxbridge site. I guess one key thing that Lafarge and we're always kind of evolving and looking at our commitment, and we've come up with what we call our 2030 plan, and really the 2030 plan kind of focuses on 4 pillars around sustainability in our work environment, and we want to look at climate, we want to look at circular economy, water, nature, and people and communities. And there's opportunities throughout this where we're able to kind of focus on biodiversity and move some of these projects forward. And one of the things that we are doing actually in the next month is we are updating our biodiversity program. We're going through some training. We're updating our beers programs just so that we can make sure that we're following the new trends and how things are moving forward. So we're really committed to looking at these opportunities, and it's an opportunity at Lafarge. Like I said, we've got within Ontario we have over 270 licensed pits and quarries, so we have a lot of opportunities there. We are doing activities at most of them. We have a commitment. The Lafarge worldwide has made a commitment that we would have biodiversity plans and rehabilitation plans at all of our sites by 2030. So it's an ambitious goal, but we are focused on it, and I think that there's lots of opportunities to work with various partners to move this forward and to have some additional great projects. So I think that's everything for me. And hopefully anybody has any questions, more than happy to answer that.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. I do have a question for you, actually. So we have heard throughout this morning about the power of partnerships. I know you gave some great examples about using Boy Scouts or the North Durham Nature Club. And I'm wondering, what would be your recommendation for companies that are looking to enter into partnerships to help achieve their ecological objectives?
Yeah, I think some of the things that worked for us, it was alignment in the goals. What do we want to get out of it? And I think too, some of the really successes is looking for partnerships with kind of the local interest. The North Durham Nature Club, again, they're a local group of people. They have the power, or they have the people power locally to come out and to undertake these initiatives. People can come out on weekends routinely. There's not a lot of travel to that. So again, it's these local groups that are in close proximity to in the communities that we operate in that seem to be very successful. And that echoes, with some of the other projects that we've been working on. At our Bath Cement plant, we have a pollinator garden. We work with local community groups down there. So again, I think the local aspect really is a benefit, and it should be something that I think others could look at.
Great, thanks, Chris. So we're scheduled to break now, and we are still a little bit behind schedule. So we're going to cut that break, and let's take 5 minutes, and let's meet back here at 11:42. And you're not going to want to miss this. I see there's already a question in the question box there, so we're going to save that for our Q&A coming up. So join us back here, I guess 4 minutes now, and we'll see you then.
Okay, so if our panelists are still on the call and not on their break, if you could put your camera on, please. We're going to move into the moderated Q&A session. I'm just going to make my dialog box here a little smaller so I can see all your beautiful faces. Okay, here we go. So we'll just wait one more minute. I think we're waiting for Chris.
I'm
And
here.
Ashley,
I'm having.
Natasha had.
Chris
Oh,
is here.
Chris, you're there. Perfect.
Yeah,
Okay.
my camera isn't working, so I am here though.
No worries. Thank you. Ashley, Natasha had to excuse herself. Is that correct?
Yeah, she had a conflict, unfortunately.
Okay.
If she's able to rejoin, she will, but you can probably go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we do have a question in the question box. So I think what we're going to do, this might actually be a question for Chris to start. Chris, the question is, in your opinion, what role do regulators have in fostering the right climate to promote industrial engagement?
That's a great question. I think that there is a portion or some, I guess, requirement or regulators could be involved, but I think sometimes that creates a bit of tension between the regulators and the industry as well. I think that they can definitely push and recommend it, but I think it really needs to kind of generate and grow kind of naturally and allow for the for these relationships to develop. I think pushing people and forcing people or forcing industry, you may not get things just may not evolve as good as developing these relationships with the local partnerships.
Perfect, thanks. Would anybody else like to jump in on that one? Okay, seeing none, we are going to move to some of my questions while we wait for the question boxes to fill up. Ashley Zug's going to be monitoring the question box. So to our participants, please put in your questions, not into the chat, but into the question box, please. Okay, so I'm seeing WHC staff. So what my question particularly for you guys, which you guys are more of a service provider as far as I know, so you're not, aggregates and digging and all of that stuff. What biodiversity conservation initiatives do you guys undertake? And what are the business drivers for those initiatives? So Margaret, do you want to take that one on first?
So Ashley, do you mean what biodiversity initiatives we implement? I'm sorry, I just didn't catch the question.
Yeah. Do you implement any, like, as a service provider? So we have a lot of environmental consultants. We have a lot of office-based companies who might be looking to, reap the benefits of conservation activities, but they're all just sitting in an office. So what do you do in that circumstance?
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities. So, WHC, our relationships tend to be with the companies. So with the OPG or with CRH, these great companies who really understand what it means to work in this space. But when we have an opportunity to convene companies together to advance a conservation activity, what we really try to do is get them to work in their own communities. So a lot of companies are making investments for climate, for example, that are distant to where they're actually working. And that's really great and really necessary. We need offsets and we need all these good things. But when we can get companies to come out of their offices and work in the community, there's a lot that they can do together, and we've done this certainly in in Northwest Indiana, in Detroit, and in other cities around the USA mostly. But we could certainly see how that model could work in Ontario very easily, because it's the same thing. It's understanding, is your driver employee engagement, community engagement, environmental education or STEM. All of these business drivers can bring people out of their offices and engage in nature-based activities, either where their offices are located or in the communities in which they have a presence. And there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do there. Again, goes back to what I said earlier, we don't need a lot of land. You really just need some imagination, and we can achieve a lot.
And I would add, Ashley, that the pandemic has prompted a lot of these conversations, right? As people are working from home, what can we do for biodiversity? So we've seen some of the companies we work with, the most recent being IBM, asking us, can you provide us some tools for employees to implement biodiversity at home, in their communities, at church, whatever they can do to take an active participation in biodiversity, even if they're kind of an office-based, non-footprint company. So there's more and more of that happening around us.
Amazing, thank you. And I think that's very inclusive, so that everybody knows that there is an option for them. So great answers, thank you very much. Anything to add from Rob or Chris?
I think just we at Lafarge, I mean, we do have large tracts of land that we can undertake these projects in, but we do have corporate offices as well, and I think that there's opportunities, like Margaret said, it doesn't have to be small, and so these companies can look at we should be looking at opportunities within our head offices. Our main office is on Airport Road in Mississauga. Is there we've got some flower beds out front. Is there opportunities in that? And I think that that's what people can really look at, and again, start small and just look what we can do.
Love it. Great. Ashley, is there a question?
Yeah, we have a question in the question box here. So it reads, has anyone approached the idea that industries like those spoken of today and developers that are required to do compensation projects have some sort of way to partner, especially if the developers are looking for alternate lands to do their compensation project on? I don't know who wants to take that.
I'm going to suggest Josie-Ann.
I was being polite. That's a good Canadian. Actually, the one example that I can use is a community in Quebec where the developers were indeed looking to establish a new community. They were landlocked, and they were definitely looking to do biodiversity and environmental projects, both for recreation and aesthetics. And they partnered with Lafarge and purchased part of their land, and that was part of the design of that new community. And Lafarge, and that was back in the early 2000s, was really clever in demonstrating their commitment in the agreement and the sale paperwork. They put in some requirements that these pieces of land would be maintained as conservation areas, that those lakes and ponds that have been made as a result of the operations be maintained in that way. So we're seeing kind of those types of collaboration, but we're also filtering some requests, and that's been continuous over the past few decades, of non-traditional lands, right? We have different stakeholders, whether they're developers, but also now, others looking to do urban agriculture. They're looking for land, and the non-traditional lands are those surplus properties, formerly operational areas. So we're seeing a lot more of these connections between non-traditional partners to maximize the use of the land for the benefit of biodiversity, but also for the benefit of the communities.
Love it. Anyone else would like to add anything? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Josiane. That was great. Okay, so another question. What is the best way to gain corporate management support for conservation initiatives, particularly if they're kind of on the fence or they're like, we don't have the time, the resources, you kind of hear that a lot. How do you overcome those objections?
I think all of us from WHC would say one thing, and that's the C-suite 16 that Margaret has showed earlier in her presentation. I think that is the key. It's building a business case and asking the tough questions of what are some of the business challenges, and to have someone in the room who can look to conservation and biodiversity as part of the solution. And when it's anchored in a business value, that is when we can see projects happen really quickly and projects stay on the ground and continue to be maintained for decades.
Yeah, from an industry perspective, I would agree with Josiane there. Like it's, really, I think the program there, the WHC has it with the C-Suite 16. That's exactly kind of where it needs to be targeted, and I think more and more that at the executive level, these people are seeing the business value in biodiversity projects, and because it does impact a lot of things, shareholder prices, just throughout the whole business cycle. So I think that is that's probably the key driver here.
And we actually broached this very topic through a webinar a few months back, and a couple of strategies that have really worked well are, kind of, if you can get an example out in front of management. So again, we have, dozens of certified programs in Ontario. So, and most of them are willing to give a tour to, a visiting company. So to see it in action here firsthand from somebody that's already doing it is one approach. Another approach is for the interested party or team member at the site to just get the green light on a very small project that virtually has zero budget, and really leverage the success of that, both internally and externally, and let the company see, imagine what we could do with a budget, right? So, and there's plenty of projects that kind of meet that criteria of a low cost, no cost threshold. So I would say those two approaches have been pretty successful.
Excellent, thank you. So just being mindful of time, I'm going to bring us to our very last kind of closing question, and I'll each give you 1 minute to speak and answer the question, and then Ashley will give us our wrap up. So the question is, what is one piece of advice you wish someone told you about business and biodiversity? So Chris, why don't we start with you, and then we'll move to Josiane, Rob, and Margaret.
Thanks, Ashley. That's a great question. I think the one piece of advice that, when we started this is it's not as scary as what you think it's going to be. I think things just kind of grow naturally out of the project, and really just, come up with an idea and create a simple idea, and it just kind of grows naturally through that. And I think that, that would be the one piece that advice that you wish that you had at the beginning, was just don't be afraid, jump in and go for it. It definitely grows and becomes a really interesting and great project.
I would say that employees really will care about these projects. I am constantly amazed when I go and visit some of the sites that have programs established at just how passionate people are, and they are so excited not only to showcase this habitat when they have visitors, but to bring their families to see it, to bring schools in, and that is key, right? We can do biodiversity project fully integrated into operations that happen automatically, but if we can bring in an aspect of volunteer employees, I think that is a surer way to success.
Since Josiane stole my answer, I'm gonna double down on that, and it has to be personal, right? So the top-down mandate from the company and the backing from the C-suite is great, and that gets the project off the ground. But for it to be sustainable over time, there needs to be flexibility to make each of these actions personal, for the longevity of the effort. We see all the time, turnover in site leadership. And if the new person isn't passionate about the same very thing that the old person was passionate about, a lot of those project actions kind of fall by the wayside. So making biodiversity personal, I think, is a good way to keep the train rolling for the long haul.
Well, I'm just going to build on everybody else's. I think what Chris said, that it grows naturally, is really great. Bringing it home to people is really great. My advice is just do it. We don't have the luxury to sit around and talk about it. Nature is in serious problem across the world. We know what we can do. We need to plant the right thing in the right place at the right time. We don't need technology. We don't need, high budgets. So just do it would be my advice.
Excellent. Great advice from everyone. Thank you very much to our panelists. And Ashley, over to you.
Great, thanks, Ashley. Let's advance to the next slide there. And I recognize I stay in between you and lunch, so I'll only take another minute or two of your time. So we just wanted to have some wrap-up notes here. Basically some of the takeaway messages. So ready or not, biodiversity is an area of concern in the private sector. It's becoming more and more so, and we continue to see these trends and how they're going to drive regulation. Margaret pointed out that there's so many entry points to get involved with respect to biodiversity. There's no real single way to engage, which is great. And there's many possibilities with respect to what you can do with limited resources. Using the pollinator example, which was great. And then Rob talked about framework. Producing a modern framework and what that looks like and how that can work, providing, biodiversity uplift and participation using those frameworks. And he also highlighted some great examples using education and awareness and how that can be utilized. And then we heard from Josie in terms of how to use that data. Share your stories, utilize that data, and not just respect to your footprint, but the positive outcomes as well. Consider the scale, your audience when you're communicating some of that data. We heard from Natasha and Chris with respect to some of the resource companies and what they're doing. They're stewards of the land. They know the land well that they operate in, and they're equipped to identify and implement nature-based solutions. But there also might be opportunities to better tell the story with respect to some of the successes the industries do have with respect to biodiversity. And these things need to be spoken about more. And then lastly, we heard throughout the day about the power of partnerships. They create new ideas, new faces, and allow space for a more holistic approach to tackling our biodiversity crisis. And so on that note, I just want to thank everyone who was able to join us here today. I especially want to thank today's panelists. And I want to thank our sponsors, Ontario Power Generation, the Invasive Species Centre, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. Special thanks go out to you. And just a reminder that our next Ontario Biodiversity Council session is funding biodiversity and nature-based solutions, or nature-based climate action, and that's on October 14th. And we really encourage you to register and attend that. And on that note, thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.